My son pushed me down the basement stairs and walked away. His wife looked down into the darkness and told him to let me rot so he would finally get the message. I lay bleeding on the cold concrete, but before losing consciousness, I made one quick call. What happened next was a ruthless lesson in respect they will never forget. I am Gregory, 69 years old, and a retired master contractor who spent my entire life building homes and providing for my family. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. The impact knocked the breath from my lungs before the pain even registered. My spine hit the concrete stairs with a sickening thud, and the distinct crack of bone echoed in the damp air of the basement. I rolled to the bottom, gasping for air, tasting copper and dust. Above me, framed in the harsh light of the kitchen doorway, stood Aaron, my own flesh and blood. He stared down at me, his face devoid of any remorse, his knuckles white as he gripped the unsigned property deed. He had demanded I leverage the family home, the house I built with my own hands, to fund another one of his hollow tech startups. When I refused to sign away my late wife Martha's legacy, his temper flared. A shove to the chest transformed a financial dispute into attempted murder. Aaron did not rush down the steps to check if I was breathing. He simply glared at my broken body at the bottom of the stairwell. He reached out, grabbed the heavy brass handle of the solid oak door, and slammed it shut. The heavy metallic click of the deadbolt sliding into place resonated through the ceiling. I was trapped in my own home, discarded by the boy I raised. The darkness enveloped me, but my senses sharpened. Through the hardwood floorboards above, Courtney's sharp, frantic voice pierced the silence. My daughter-in-law was not calling for an ambulance. She was complaining about the drops of my blood that had splattered onto her pristine designer shoes during the altercation. She scolded Aaron for being careless, reminding him with ice-cold practical urgency that they had a charity gala to attend in less than an hour. She demanded he go wash his hands immediately so they would not be late for their high society friends. Her voice carried no panic for my life, only irritation at the inconvenience my potential death might cause her evening schedule. I lay on the freezing floor, listening to the muffled sounds of water running in the kitchen sink. I heard the distinct clatter of Courtney's heels pacing the hallway, impatient and entirely unbothered by the fact that her father-in-law was bleeding out just a few feet below her. They were leaving me to die. They assumed a man of my age would simply succumb to the injuries, passing away quietly in the cold, leaving them free to inherit the estate without the hassle of a living, breathing obstacle. The heavy front door opened and closed. The engine of Courtney's luxury SUV roared to life in the driveway. The tires crunched against the gravel, and the sound of their departure slowly faded into the quiet hum of the suburban evening. I was completely alone. The physical agony radiating from my spine was nothing compared to the absolute clarity settling into my mind. The illusion of family had vanished, replaced by the raw, brutal reality of their greed. I did not scream for help. Yelling would only waste the precious little oxygen left in my lungs, and there was no one left in the house to hear me anyway. Survival required calculation, not panic. Every movement sent waves of blinding agony through my fractured ribs and spine, but I forced my arms to bear my weight. I dragged my shattered body across the dusty, abrasive concrete floor, leaving a dark trail of blood behind me. I focused entirely on a thick, rusted water pipe tucked behind the old water heater in the darkest corner of the basement. I had spent 40 years constructing buildings, and I always knew the value of structural secrets. Reaching the pipe, my trembling fingers fumbled along the back of the cold metal until they brushed against a small magnetic lockbox taped out of sight. I pulled the box down, flipped the latch open, and retrieved a cheap prepaid flip phone. It was a burner device completely disconnected from my main cellular plan, untraceable by Aaron, who constantly monitored my primary phone bill. I flipped the screen open. The glaring backlight illuminated my blood-stained hands. I did not dial emergency services. The police could wait. The immediate threat was not my physical death, but the financial massacre Aaron and Courtney were planning to execute the moment I was out of the picture. I pressed a single speed dial button. The phone connected securely to a private line I had maintained for the past decade. It was the direct number to a man who understood the architecture of warfare just as well as I understood the architecture of concrete and steel. I held the phone to my ear, tasting the metallic tang of blood on my lips, ready to initiate the total destruction of my son's comfortable reality. Bradley answered on the very first ring. As a former prosecutor turned private wealth attorney, he never missed a call from his most discreet client. He did not greet me with pleasantries. He heard my shallow, labored breathing and simply waited for instructions. I gave him a clear two-word command that would ignite the destruction of Aaron and Courtney's entire world. Freeze everything. I snapped the phone shut, tucked it securely into the deep pocket of my jacket, and let my head rest against the freezing concrete. 10 minutes later, the faint, high-pitched wail of sirens cut through the quiet night air. Bradley had dispatched them exactly as protocol dictated. The heavy boots of paramedics pounded against the front porch. The front door cracked under the force of a battering ram, and moments later the heavy oak basement door was kicked open. Flashlights swept through the darkness, finally landing on my battered body. I heard the urgent shouts of the emergency responders rushing down the stairs. As their hands checked my pulse and secured my neck in a brace, I made a tactical decision. I closed my eyes, let my muscles go completely limp, and intentionally played the role of a confused, dying old man. I muttered incoherent phrases, pretending the fall had stolen my memory and my mind. It was the perfect camouflage. By feigning severe dementia and physical helplessness, I would completely lower my enemy's defenses. Aaron and Courtney would return from their gala believing they had won. They would think I was a broken, silent victim. They had no idea I had just locked down a secret empire they did not even know existed. The stretcher lifted me out of the darkness and into the flashing red lights of the ambulance. The trap was set. The harsh fluorescent lights of the intensive care unit burned through my closed eyelids. The steady rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor was the only authentic sound in the room. I kept my breathing shallow, allowing my senses to map the environment before I opened my eyes. A police officer stood at the foot of my hospital bed, his heavy duty belt creaking slightly as he shifted his weight. Right beside him, Aaron and Courtney were delivering a flawless theatrical performance designed to secure their alibi. Courtney clutched a crumpled tissue, her shoulders shaking with fabricated sobs that sounded entirely too perfect. She dabbed carefully at the corners of her eyes, making absolutely sure not to smear her expensive mascara. Aaron stood close to her, playing the role of the devastated, dutiful son. His voice dripped with practiced sorrow as he explained the tragedy to the officer. He claimed my mind had been slipping for months, fabricating a narrative of worsening dementia to explain how a master contractor could simply fall down a set of stairs he had built himself. He painted a picture of a confused, dying old man who had tragically lost his footing in the dark. I listened to my own son casually erase my sanity to cover up his crime. The audacity of his lie was staggering. He was building a legal defense right in front of me, using my age as a weapon to strip away my credibility. I kept my expression slack, letting my jaw hang slightly open. I was a man who had spent 40 years constructing unbreakable foundations, and I knew exactly how to dismantle the one Aaron was building. I let my eyelids flutter open, staring blankly past the officer, perfectly embodying the broken victim they needed me to be. The police officer stepped closer, a look of genuine sympathy softening his stern features. He pulled a small notepad from his breast pocket and gently leaned over the metal bed rail. He asked me in a slow, deliberate voice if I could tell him what happened in the basement. The temperature in the room plummeted. Aaron stiffened instantly. He took a rigid step forward, positioning himself directly in my line of sight. His eyes bored into mine, carrying a silent, violent threat. He was daring me to tell the truth, silently promising that if I exposed his attempted murder, he would find a way to finish the job. He needed me to validate the story he had just sold to the authorities. The power dynamic in the room was entirely in my hands. I could speak up, point a trembling finger at my son, and have him arrested for assault. But putting Aaron in handcuffs today would leave Courtney free to liquidate the accounts and run. A simple arrest was not enough to cure this infection. I needed total financial annihilation. I blinked slowly, letting a glassy, unfocused expression wash over my face. I looked at the officer, let out a weak, raspy breath, and softly claimed I could not remember the fall. I whispered that the basement was dark and my memory was completely gone. The effect on Aaron was immediate and visceral. He exhaled a massive, shuddering breath, the tension leaving his shoulders in a rush of profound relief. He actually placed a hand over his heart, acting as though a terrible burden had been lifted. He truly believed he had won. He believed the fall had successfully broken my mind, clearing the path for him to take everything I owned. The officer closed his notepad, offered a few final words of comfort, and walked out of the intensive care unit. The heavy door swung shut and the latch clicked into place. The transformation was instantaneous and chilling. The very second the police officer was out of earshot, Courtney dropped her crying act completely. Her tears vanished. Her shaking shoulders straightened. She tossed the crumpled tissue into the wastebasket with a look of pure disgust. She reached into her designer handbag, pulled out a sleek digital tablet, and marched directly to the side of my bed. Her face was set in a mask of ruthless determination. She shoved the bright screen inches from my face, displaying a dense legal document. She turned to Aaron and demanded he get the medical power of attorney signed right now while I was still heavily medicated. She argued with ice-cold logic that my statement to the police proved I was incompetent. She insisted they needed absolute control over my estate before the hospital social workers started asking difficult questions. Aaron hesitated for a fraction of a second, glancing at my bruised face, but his greed quickly overrode any lingering shred of human decency. He stepped up beside his wife, pulling a stylus from his pocket. He leaned over me, his shadow blocking out the harsh hospital lights. He told me to just sign the screen, promising that they would take care of everything from now on. They were attempting a hostile takeover of my life while I lay bleeding in a hospital bed. They assumed I was too weak to resist the pressure, too confused to understand that signing that digital document would sign away my freedom, my wealth, and my dignity. Before the stylus could touch the glass screen, the hospital room door swung open with enough force to bang loudly against the wall guard. Bradley stepped inside. My private wealth attorney wore a flawlessly tailored charcoal suit, projecting an aura of absolute intimidating authority. He did not ask for permission to enter. He did not offer any polite greetings. He walked straight past the foot of my bed, his polished leather shoes clicking sharply against the linoleum floor. Without breaking his stride, Bradley dropped a thick, bright red folder directly onto Courtney's lap. The heavy thud of the documents hitting her knees made her flinch and drop the digital tablet onto the mattress. Aaron demanded to know who this man was and what he was doing, interrupting a private family medical moment. Bradley ignored the question entirely. He looked down at Courtney and advised her to read the first page. She opened the red folder, her eyes darting across the legal text. All the color drained from her face in a matter of seconds. The document was a formal, expedited foreclosure notice for Aaron's tech startup. It detailed the immediate seizure of all commercial assets, servers, and intellectual property due to massive unpaid leverage. The hidden financial rot Aaron had desperately tried to conceal was now exposed under the harsh hospital lights. Aaron snatched the paper from his wife's trembling hands. His jaw dropped as he read the catastrophic numbers. He looked at Bradley in sheer panic, realizing his entire corporate facade had just been demolished. The dynamic shifted violently. The arrogant son who had pushed his father down a flight of concrete stairs suddenly realized he was not the one in control. The predator had just become the prey. Aaron stared at the foreclosure notice, his hands shaking violently as the glossy paper crinkled under his tight grip. Bradley did not give him a single moment to fabricate another lie. My attorney stepped forward, his voice a low, lethal weapon slicing through the sterile hospital air. Bradley systematically dismantled the illusion of my son's successful tech startup. He detailed exactly how Aaron had leveraged non-existent software contracts to secure high-risk loans, burning through the cash to maintain a fabricated high-society lifestyle. When the traditional banks cut him off entirely, Aaron turned to the kind of lenders who did not negotiate repayment terms in downtown courtrooms. Bradley pulled a second document from his tailored jacket and slapped it flat against Aaron's chest. The paper listed a staggering debt of $1.5 million owed to a violent underground syndicate operating out of the city's Port District. The brutal truth materialized in the cold room. My son had not lost his temper in the basement. The push down the concrete stairs was a calculated, desperate attempt at murder. Aaron needed me dead to trigger the inheritance clause of my estate, intending to liquidate the house I built with my bare hands to save his own kneecaps from the mob's enforcers. He traded my life for a ledger of bad debts. The color drained entirely from Aaron's face, leaving him looking like a cornered animal. He opened his mouth to deny the charges, but the overwhelming weight of Bradley's irrefutable evidence choked the words in his throat. He looked at me, searching for the confused old man he thought he had broken, but he found only the silent, calculating stare of a survivor watching a traitor fall into a permanent trap. I remained perfectly still against the stiff hospital pillows, absorbing the sheer magnitude of the betrayal. My mind drifted back to the grueling decades I spent laying bricks, pouring concrete, and inhaling drywall dust just to pay for Aaron's elite private schooling and his expensive college tuition. I had shattered my own joints to ensure my son would never have to swing a hammer or struggle for his next meal. I had handed him the world on a silver platter, and he had responded by attempting to break my spine to satisfy his vicious greed. He viewed 40 years of my unwavering fatherly devotion as nothing more than a delayed mob payout. The silence in the intensive care unit grew suffocating, broken only by the sharp, sudden chime of Bradley's smartphone. My attorney pulled the device from his pocket, his eyes narrowing as he read the glowing notification. He looked directly at Aaron with a smile devoid of any warmth. Bradley announced a live security alert from my primary financial institution. Less than 20 minutes after leaving me for dead in the basement, Courtney had marched into a high-end luxury jeweler downtown. She had bypassed the emergency contact protocols and explicitly used my dedicated medical credit card, an account reserved strictly for life-saving surgeries and critical care. She had just swiped the magnetic strip for a $50,000 diamond necklace. Courtney was aggressively liquidating my emergency health funds to buy glittering accessories while I was strapped to a trauma board. Aaron's eyes widened in sheer panic, realizing his wife had just detonated a massive financial bomb they could not cover. He reached for his phone, desperate to warn her, but the mechanism of my retribution was already in motion. I pushed myself up from the mattress, ignoring the searing pain radiating through my fractured ribs. The facade of the fragile, dementia-ridden old man evaporated instantly. I locked eyes with Aaron, projecting the unyielding authority of a man who had built a massive empire from dirt and grit. I spoke my first clear, commanding sentence since being pulled from the basement floor. I ordered Bradley to permanently cancel the medical credit card immediately and flag the $50,000 transaction as grand theft. Aaron lunged forward, raising his hands in a frantic, pathetic gesture of surrender. He begged me to reconsider, stammering that a felony fraud charge would ruin Courtney's pristine reputation and destroy her entire career. He pleaded for a peaceful family resolution, completely ignoring the fact that his version of a family resolution involved leaving me to bleed to death on a cold concrete floor. I did not raise my voice. I did not show a single ounce of the fury boiling inside my chest. I simply instructed my attorney to initiate the strict fraud protocols without delay. Bradley tapped the screen of his phone twice, communicating directly with the bank's executive fraud division. The digital guillotine fell instantly. The medical account was permanently frozen, and an automated alert was dispatched to local law enforcement identifying the unauthorized user. The luxury purchase transitioned from a shopping spree to a major financial crime in a matter of seconds. I watched Aaron clutch his head in his hands, the reality of his total powerlessness crashing down upon him. He had brought a sledgehammer to a chess match, and I was methodically taking all his pieces from the board. The era of my unconditional financial protection had officially ended, replaced by absolute, unforgiving accountability. The sharp, aggressive ringing of Aaron's cell phone shattered the heavy silence in the hospital room. He fumbled with the device, his fingers slipping against the glass screen before answering the call on speakerphone. Courtney's furious, panicked voice flooded the intensive care unit. She was screaming hysterically, demanding to know why my medical account had declined her purchase. Her shrieks echoed off the sterile walls as she frantically explained that the store manager had locked the front doors and refused to let her leave the premises. The jeweler had explicitly informed her that the transaction was flagged as stolen property, and 2 patrol cars were already pulling up to the storefront to escort her to the precinct for questioning regarding felony credit fraud. Aaron stood frozen, the phone trembling near his ear, completely incapable of formulating a response that could save his wife from the back of a police squad car. He slowly lowered the device, his eyes darting from the glowing screen to my calm, resolute face. The terrifying truth finally penetrated his arrogant mind. The dementia was a lie. The confusion was a trap. His father was not a senile victim waiting to be slaughtered for a massive inheritance. He realized he was facing a fully lucid, incredibly dangerous adversary who had just orchestrated the swift arrest of his wife with a single sentence. I leaned back against the pillows, maintaining an icy, unwavering stare that promised nothing but total destruction. Aaron swallowed hard, the last remnants of his confidence turning to ash right in front of me. He backed away toward the door, realizing he had awakened a monster he could not control. The trap had snapped shut, the boundaries were drawn, and the ruthless war for my survival had officially begun. Aaron's hands shook violently as he dialed the precinct. I watched him pace the narrow hospital corridor through the glass window of my ICU room, his face slick with a cold, terrified sweat. He was trapped in a nightmare of his own making, forced to negotiate with a furious store manager and the arresting officers currently holding his wife. Courtney had not just embarrassed them in public. She had committed felony credit card fraud using a flagged medical emergency account. To prevent her from being processed and spending the night in a concrete holding cell, Aaron had to act immediately. The underground syndicate he owed did not care about family drama. They only cared about their money, and they were watching his every move. He was forced to drain the absolute last of his hidden personal cash reserves. This was the specific money he had desperately hoarded to temporarily placate the violent enforcers breathing down his neck. He wired the massive bail amount directly from his phone, wiping out his final financial safety net in a matter of seconds. The realization of what he had just done hit him visibly. He leaned heavily against the sterile corridor wall, clutching his chest as if he were the one suffering a medical emergency. He had sacrificed his ultimate survival fund to clean up Courtney's greedy, impulsive mess. By triggering that specific fraud protocol, I had forced him to disarm himself completely. He was now entirely out of capital and out of time with the mob. He had played a reckless game of chess, assuming I was nothing more than a senile spectator. Instead, I had cornered his king in exactly 2 moves. He shoved his phone into his pocket and turned back toward my room, his expression morphing from absolute panic into a desperate, hollow rage. The reality of his impending ruin was settling deep into his bones. Less than 2 hours later, the heavy ICU door was shoved open with aggressive force. Courtney stormed into my room, completely abandoning any remaining pretense of the grieving daughter-in-law. Her designer outfit was wrinkled, and the expensive mascara she had so carefully preserved earlier was now smeared darkly beneath her furious eyes. The deep humiliation of being detained in a jewelry store lobby had stripped away her polished high society facade, revealing the raw, entitled opportunist underneath. She marched straight to the side of my bed, jabbing a manicured finger toward my face. She demanded that I call the bank instantly, lift the fraud alert, and clear her name before the local social circles caught wind of her arrest. When I remained perfectly still, her anger escalated into pure venom. She loudly declared that she deserved that $50,000 necklace as rightful compensation. She claimed she had spent years enduring the burden of my existence, acting as a dutiful relative while waiting for my supposedly decaying mind to finally give out. She weaponized her position in the family, shouting that dealing with a stubborn, aging man who refused to hand over his assets entitled her to an immediate advance on the inheritance. Courtney insisted the money was already theirs, and that I was simply being maliciously stingy by refusing to die on their preferred timeline. She commanded me to drop the act, unlock the funds, and apologize for embarrassing her in public. Her shrill voice echoed off the medical monitors, painting a pathetic picture of a woman who believed her marital tie to my son granted her unlimited access to a lifetime of my grueling labor. I did not flinch, allowing her to fully exhaust her toxic tirade before I delivered the absolute counterstrike. I slowly reached over to the rolling bedside table and picked up a crisp, folded piece of paper Bradley had left for me. I held it out in silence. Courtney snatched it from my fingers, her eyes darting frantically across the printed text. It was not a bank release form or a letter of apology. It was a detailed receipt of every single unauthorized transaction she had attempted to make using my medical emergency card over the past 48 hours. While I was bleeding on the basement floor, she had been mapping out a luxury shopping spree. I looked directly into her enraged eyes and shattered her fundamental assumption about my finances. I informed her that the emergency card was never meant to cover my current hospital stay. I explained that the entire medical bill, from the ambulance ride to the intensive care unit, was already fully paid by a premium corporate insurance policy. I watched the utter confusion wash over her face as I revealed the truth about the supposedly small, irrelevant contracting business she had mocked for years. That business was a highly lucrative corporate entity that I had built from the dirt up, generating a massive fortune I had systematically hidden from their greedy hands. I told her that she had risked federal prison for a shiny piece of jewelry, entirely unaware that she was dealing with a multi-millionaire who tracked every single dime. I exposed her shallow greed, stating coldly that she had thrown her freedom away for a tiny fraction of the wealth she could have inherited had she simply shown genuine respect. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. She suddenly understood she had grossly underestimated the very man she had plotted to discard. Aaron grabbed Courtney by the arm, his grip tight enough to make her gasp in pain. He forcibly dragged his wife out of the hospital room, silencing her rising protests with a harsh, desperate whisper. The heavy door clicked shut behind them, cutting off the remnants of their frantic argument. I was left alone in the quiet hum of the medical machines, the absolute silence returning to the sterile room. I adjusted my position against the stiff pillows, feeling the deep, agonizing ache in my fractured spine, but the pain was entirely eclipsed by a sharp, metallic vibration against my leg. I pulled the prepaid flip phone from my jacket pocket. The small screen glowed brightly in the dim light, displaying a high-priority security alert. It was a silent notification triggered by the advanced surveillance network I had integrated into the foundation of my estate years ago. The perimeter sensors at my house had just been breached. Aaron had not gone home to rest or to formulate a legal defense for his wife. Driven by the absolute terror of his impending mob deadline, he had driven straight to my property. The digital readouts on my screen indicated motion in the primary hallway, followed immediately by heavy impacts in the lower levels. Aaron was currently tearing the house apart with his bare hands. He was desperately searching for the master safe, hunting for the physical property deeds and the original will. He believed that if he could find the raw documents, he could somehow force a transfer of ownership to pay off the syndicate before they came to end his life. He was destroying my home to save his own skin. I stared at the blinking security alert, my mind shifting instantly from defense to offense. The attending physician practically shouted when I demanded my release papers. He cited my fractured spine and the immense risk of permanent paralysis. I ignored his medical warnings entirely. Staying in that hospital bed meant ceding the battlefield to my son. I signed the discharge forms against medical advice and had Bradley arrange private transport immediately. The ride back to my property was a symphony of physical agony. Every bump in the road sent white-hot spikes of pain up my back. I sat rigidly in the transit wheelchair, refusing to show a fraction of the torment consuming my body. I had survived 40 years of grueling labor as a black contractor in a city that desperately wanted me to fail. A fractured spine was just another obstacle to bulldoze through. Bradley pushed my wheelchair up the familiar concrete ramp I had poured decades ago. We stopped abruptly at the main entrance. The heavy mahogany front door hung awkwardly on its hinges. The reinforced brass lock had been brutally shattered, the wood violently splintered around the frame. Aaron had not bothered to use his spare key. He had breached the house with the frenzy of a cornered animal. His desperation had overridden his logic entirely. I raised my hand, signaling Bradley to stay back on the porch. I needed to handle this internal breach alone. I gripped the wheels of my chair and pushed myself over the ruined threshold. The house was entirely silent except for a heavy, rhythmic thud echoing from the lower level. I navigated the hallway, ignoring the sharp pains shooting through my torso. The destruction of my front door was a clear declaration of war. I guided the wheelchair silently across the hardwood floor toward the basement corridor. The heavy, rhythmic thuds vibrated violently through the floorboards, shaking the framed photographs hanging on the hallway walls. I positioned myself directly at the top of the concrete stairs. The descent below was a scene of absolute chaos. Aaron stood in the center of the basement, his expensive, tailored shirt discarded on the filthy floor. He was drenched in a foul, panic-induced sweat. His muscles strained as he swung a massive steel sledgehammer directly into the finished drywall I had installed 5 years ago. White dust coated the air, sticking to his hair and skin in a thick paste. He swung again and again, tearing down the physical boundaries of my home. He was systematically destroying the structure to hunt for the master safe. He needed the original property deeds and the physical copies of my last will and testament to execute a fraudulent transfer of assets. The mob was demanding $1.5 million, and Aaron truly believed the walls of my basement held his salvation. He tore at the insulation with his bare hands, coughing through the cloud of gypsum dust. His eyes were wide and frantic, darting desperately across the exposed wooden studs. He kicked aside fiberglass insulation, oblivious to the shards cutting into his palms. He moved like a desperate addict looking for his next fix, completely consumed by the terror of his impending deadline. He ripped down another sheet of drywall, tossing the debris carelessly across the room. He had entirely forgotten the man who had taught him how to hold a hammer. I sat at the top of the stairs, watching the boy I had raised dismantle my property piece by piece. I reached out and flipped the heavy industrial switch mounted on the wall. A bank of high-intensity halogen floodlights instantly bathed the entire basement in a harsh, blinding glare. Aaron recoiled violently, throwing his arms up to shield his eyes from the sudden brightness. The sledgehammer slipped from his grip, crashing loudly against the concrete floor and sending a sharp vibration straight up the stairs. He spun around his chest, heaving aggressively as he squinted into the light. When his vision cleared and he registered my presence at the top of the staircase, all the remaining color drained from his face. He stared at me sitting in the wheelchair, realizing his paralyzed, confused father was entirely an act. The silence stretched between us thick and unforgiving. Aaron scrambled to assemble a pathetic defense. He wiped the toxic mixture of sweat and drywall dust from his forehead, attempting to force a calm, rational smile. His voice cracked as he claimed he had rushed over to check on the house and discovered severe water damage behind the walls. He lied straight to my face, insisting he was merely tearing out the ruined insulation to save the foundation from rotting. It was a pathetic, insulting fabrication. The basement was bone dry. I did not utter a single word in response. I simply stared down at him, my silence stripping away every shred of his deceit. His fake smile faltered. He looked at the shattered drywall, the heavy sledgehammer, and the complete lack of any water damage. He knew I saw right through his act. I let the quiet, heavy reality of his failure press down on him until he broke eye contact. The sheer weight of his own transparent lie crushed the air from his lungs. Aaron took a hesitant step backward, his eyes darting frantically for an escape route. As he shifted his weight, his gaze snagged on a dull metallic gleam hidden deep within the exposed wall cavity. Wedged tightly between two reinforced wooden studs sat a heavy fireproof steel lockbox. The sheer panic in his eyes instantly morphed into ravenous greed. He ignored my presence entirely. He grabbed a rusted crowbar from the floor and lunged at the exposed wall cavity. He jammed the iron tip directly under the heavy latch of the steel box. He threw his entire body weight against the lever, grunting with aggressive exertion. The thick metal latch groaned under the pressure and finally snapped off with a sharp, echoing crack. Aaron tore the heavy lid open, his chest heaving with desperate anticipation. He fully expected to find stacks of high-yield bearer bonds, raw cash, or the original unencumbered deed to the $1 million estate. He plunged his dusty hands into the box and pulled out a single, heavily laminated document. He held it up to the harsh halogen light, his eyes scanning the dense legal text. His shoulders slumped immediately. His jaw dropped in utter disbelief. He was reading the unchallengeable, legally binding declaration of ownership I had executed 10 years ago. He realized the absolute futility of his violent home invasion. His entire escape plan evaporated into dust right before his eyes. The paper explicitly detailed that the multi-million-dollar property he was currently destroying did not belong to me. It belonged entirely to an irrevocable entity. He could not leverage it. He could not sell it. He could not steal it to pay off his dangerous underworld debts. Aaron's eyes tracked across the heavy black ink of the laminated document, his pupils dilating as the catastrophic reality set in. The paper in his shaking hands was a certified declaration of trust. It explicitly stated that the house, the property, the hidden corporate accounts, and every single asset I owned had been irrevocably transferred into the Martha Trust. I had executed this transfer exactly 10 years ago on the very day my beautiful wife was lowered into the earth. Sitting at her graveside, I had looked at the distant relatives and sudden friends who materialized out of thin air, and I realized a brutal truth. Wealth attracts parasites, and a grieving widower is the perfect host. I had immediately hired Bradley to construct a legal fortress so impenetrable that no court in the state could pierce its walls. I designated the trust to hold the entirety of my life's work, removing my personal ownership of the estate and transforming me merely into its protected beneficiary. Aaron had spent the last decade secretly salivating over an inheritance that simply did not exist. He believed he was the default heir to a sprawling empire, completely unaware that his mother's namesake trust carried strict, unforgiving conditions. His assumption of ultimate power was entirely fabricated. He dropped the laminated paper onto the concrete floor as if it had burned his fingers. The basement, which he had just violently destroyed in his desperate hunt for a financial savior, suddenly felt like a tomb. He looked up at me, his chest heaving, realizing that the sledgehammer and the crowbar were completely useless against a wall of ironclad legal text. The absolute destruction of his escape plan shattered whatever fragile sanity Aaron had left. He lost his mind, completely pacing the ruined basement and screaming hoarse, incoherent threats into the damp air before fleeing the house into the night. But desperation breeds a special kind of stupidity. At 9 o'clock the very next morning, the splintered front door swung open. Aaron marched into my living room, trailing a cheap, poorly dressed strip mall lawyer behind him. The man wore a shiny, ill-fitting suit and carried a scuffed leather briefcase reeking of cheap cologne and sheer desperation. Aaron pointed an accusing finger at me as I sat calmly in my wheelchair by the fireplace. He commanded his hired gun to attack. The fake lawyer immediately launched into a rehearsed, aggressive monologue. He threatened me with a massive civil lawsuit for fraudulent concealment of family assets, claiming my transfer of the estate into the Martha Trust was an illegal maneuver designed to financially cripple my primary heir. He paced the living room rug, shouting legal jargon and threatening to drag me into a grueling, years-long court battle that would supposedly drain every dime I had left. He slammed a poorly drafted legal petition onto the coffee table right next to my morning cup of black coffee. He pulled a cheap plastic pen from his breast pocket and demanded I sign the document immediately to dissolve the trust and transfer total control of the assets back to Aaron. He promised that if I signed, they would mercifully drop the lawsuit and allow me to live out my remaining days in peace. It was a pathetic, transparent shakedown orchestrated by a drowning man and executed by a legal bottom feeder. I completely ignored the lawyer's pathetic posturing. I did not look at his fraudulent paperwork, nor did I acknowledge the cheap pen hovering over my coffee table. Instead, I reached into the deep pocket of my jacket and retrieved the same prepaid burner phone I had used in the basement. I flipped the screen open, my thumb resting deliberately on the keypad. I looked past the hired gun and locked eyes directly with my son. I pressed a single button. The digital speaker crackled to life, and the crystal-clear audio recording from the night of my fall filled the quiet living room. The sound of my own shattered breathing echoed from the tiny device, immediately followed by the sharp, unmistakable sound of Aaron slamming the heavy oak basement door. Then Courtney's voice cut through the air, cold, calculating, and vicious. Her exact words resonated perfectly against the living room walls. "Let him rot down there. Maybe now he will get the message." The recording captured the undeniable sound of their footsteps walking away, leaving me bleeding on the concrete floor to attend their high society gala. I let the audio play until the final crunch of their SUV tires faded into silence. I closed the flip phone with a sharp snap and set it gently on top of the fake legal petition. I did not need to shout or match their aggressive energy. The digital recording was a tactical nuclear strike. It was raw, unassailable evidence of premeditated attempted murder and criminal conspiracy. I leaned back in my wheelchair, watching the absolute horror wash over the faces of the two men standing in my living room. The corrupt lawyer turned a sickening shade of pale. The aggressive swagger he had carried into my home evaporated instantly, replaced by the primal terror of a man who just realized he had stepped into a federal crime scene. He stared at the burner phone sitting on the coffee table as if it were a live hand grenade. He knew perfectly well that continuing to represent Aaron after hearing a direct recording of an attempted murder plot would instantly expose him to severe criminal charges, including accessory after the fact and conspiracy to commit homicide. Without uttering a single word of his rehearsed legal threats, he frantically grabbed his scuffed briefcase. He did not ask Aaron for his retainer. He simply turned on his heel and sprinted out the splintered front door, leaving a trail of cheap cologne in his wake. His car tires squealed against the asphalt as he fled the neighborhood, desperate to put as much distance between himself and my son as physically possible. Aaron was left standing completely alone in the center of the living room, entirely defenseless. His hired gun had abandoned him. His tech company was in foreclosure, and his mob creditors were actively hunting him down. The unassailable leverage of the Martha Trust stood like a reinforced concrete wall between him and his survival. He stared at me with hollow, defeated eyes, realizing he had absolutely no legal or financial weapons left to fight with. But the war was not over. While Aaron crumbled under the weight of his total failure, Courtney refused to accept defeat. Knowing her husband was utterly useless, she decided to abandon the legal route entirely and play a much dirtier, far more destructive game. Courtney did not wait for the dust to settle in the living room. Recognizing that Aaron's brute force and legal intimidation had failed spectacularly against the ironclad walls of the trust, she immediately pivoted to a weapon far more insidious and destructive. She retreated to her luxury SUV parked in the driveway, locked the heavy doors, and dialed the emergency hotline for Adult Protective Services. Her voice over the phone was a masterclass in calculated hysteria. She wept directly into the receiver, feeding the state dispatcher a meticulously fabricated, terrifying narrative. She reported me as a violently delusional schizophrenic who had recently suffered a massive physical trauma and subsequently lost all grip on reality. She claimed I was hoarding dangerous tools, aggressively threatening my family and posing an immediate severe danger to myself and the surrounding neighborhood. She insisted with faux devastation that my fractured spine was the direct result of a manic episode where I purposefully hurled myself down the stairs in a fit of paranoid rage. This was not a desperate plea for medical intervention. It was a precise, ruthless legal maneuver designed to bypass the protections of the Martha Trust entirely. If the state officially deemed me a threat to society and stripped away my civil rights under an involuntary psychiatric hold, Courtney could easily petition the court for a permanent emergency conservatorship. A court-appointed conservator would gain immediate overriding control of my medical and financial decisions, effectively rendering the trust invisible and granting her direct, unrestricted access to the accounts. She was weaponizing the very system designed to protect vulnerable seniors, twisting it into a tool of absolute financial extraction. She hung up the phone, checked her makeup in the rearview mirror, and eagerly prepared the stage for my ultimate public humiliation. The flashing red and blue lights of 3 separate police cruisers bathed the front of my estate in an aggressive, strobing glare. They parked haphazardly across the manicured lawn, accompanied by a heavy paramedic transport unit and a sterile white county vehicle belonging to Adult Protective Services. 2 stern-faced social workers stepped out, clutching thick institutional clipboards, flanked immediately by 3 armed police officers resting their hands on their holstered weapons. They treated my home like a highly volatile crime scene, completely assuming they were walking into a deadly, unpredictable confrontation with an unhinged madman. Courtney was already waiting for them on the damp grass, delivering the absolute performance of her life. She threw her arms around the lead social worker, burying her face in the woman's shoulder while producing a series of flawless, racking sobs. She wiped away non-existent tears with the back of her trembling hand, flawlessly playing the role of the traumatized, exhausted daughter-in-law who had tried absolutely everything to save her decaying father. She pointed a shaking finger toward the splintered front door, explicitly warning the officers that I was highly aggressive, completely detached from reality, and armed with heavy construction tools. Aaron stood slightly behind her on the grass, pale and silent, perfectly content to let his wife execute the brutal character assassination he was too cowardly to perform himself. The lead police officer signaled his tactical team to fan out across the porch, treating the shattered doorframe as undeniable evidence of my supposed violent rampage. They unclipped their radios, formally requesting a standby team for a hostile involuntary psychiatric transfer. Courtney watched them ascend the concrete steps, her tear-stained face temporarily masking a sick smirk of absolute victory. She firmly believed she had successfully engineered my removal from the property. The lead officer kicked the remnants of the splintered front door entirely open, stepping into the foyer with his hand hovering aggressively over his service weapon. He barked a loud, authoritative command into the quiet house, demanding that I show my empty hands and step outside immediately for a mandatory medical evaluation. He fully anticipated a screaming match, expecting a delusional old man to throw heavy objects, resist arrest, or shout paranoid conspiracy theories. He expected unbridled chaos to validate the invasion. I gave him absolute, terrifying stillness. I navigated my wheelchair out of the dark shadows of the living room, rolling smoothly and silently onto the wooden planks of the front porch. I did not raise my voice in protest. I did not show a single ounce of fear, agitation, or confusion. I sat perfectly upright in the chair, my hands resting casually on my lap, wearing a crisply pressed shirt and a look of profound, unwavering composure. The armed officers immediately froze in their tracks, their aggressive tactical posture faltering as the reality of my calm demeanor clashed violently with Courtney's hysterical description. The lead social worker stepped forward cautiously, reciting the strict legal parameters of an involuntary psychiatric hold. She informed me that I was legally considered an immediate danger to myself and required swift transport to a state facility for a mandatory 72-hour observation period. I did not interrupt her speech. I did not argue against the parameters of the law or attempt to loudly plead my sanity to the armed men surrounding me. Arguing with an emergency response team only serves to validate the accusation of mental instability. Instead, I nodded in polite acknowledgement, maintaining a steady, intimidating eye contact that made the officers shift uncomfortably on my porch. Before the paramedics could unlatch the heavy metal stretcher from the back of the ambulance, a sleek black sedan turned sharply into my driveway, tires screeching harshly against the asphalt. The vehicle aggressively blocked the ambulance's exit path, effectively trapping the emergency responders on the property. Bradley stepped out of the driver's side door, straightening his tailored jacket with the cold, measured precision of an executioner. He bypassed the police barricade entirely, marching directly across the lawn toward the lead social worker with unflinching purpose. He did not introduce himself with polite professional pleasantries. He thrust a thick, officially sealed envelope directly against the social worker's chest. The document inside was a comprehensive, legally certified psychiatric and neurological evaluation. I had not spent the morning sitting idle while Aaron threatened me with a cheap lawyer. Fully aware that Aaron and Courtney would escalate their malicious tactics the moment they discovered the invincible nature of the Martha Trust, I had Bradley dispatch the state's foremost independent neurologist to my living room just hours prior. The sealed medical report confirmed with absolute, irrefutable scientific authority that my cognitive functions were flawless, my memory was perfect, and I possessed zero psychological abnormalities. The evaluation legally preempted and permanently blocked any local or state attempt at an involuntary hold or forced medical conservatorship. The social worker scanned the certified state seals and the prominent physician's signature, her face dropping rapidly as she realized the massive legal error she was about to commit. Bradley turned slowly on his heel, his piercing gaze locking directly onto Courtney's trembling frame. He announced in a voice loud enough for every armed police officer to hear that his client was not the one suffering from delusions. The trap snapped completely shut on Courtney's final desperate scheme. Bradley moved with the calculated precision of a predator closing in on its prey. He handed the heavy wax-sealed envelope directly to the lead police officer, completely bypassing the stunned adult protective services workers. The officer broke the seal and scanned the dense medical terminology. Bradley did not wait for him to finish reading. He explicitly outlined the contents with a voice that carried across the damp evening lawn. The state's premier neurologist had subjected me to a grueling 5-hour cognitive battery just yesterday, evaluating everything from short-term memory retention to complex spatial reasoning. The official results confirmed my brain was functioning with absolute flawless clarity, entirely devoid of the paranoid schizophrenia Courtney had so vividly described. The social workers exchanged panicked glances, realizing they had been manipulated into facilitating an illegal home invasion. But Bradley was not finished. He reached into his tailored jacket and produced a second aggressively drafted legal document. He handed it to the bewildered officer, loudly announcing it as a sworn formal complaint against Courtney for felony false reporting, malicious defamation, and severe elder harassment. Bradley detailed how she had weaponized a vital public emergency system, intentionally wasting municipal resources to execute a hostile financial takeover against a perfectly healthy senior citizen. He cited specific penal codes, reminding the armed men on my porch that filing a fraudulent psychiatric hold was a serious criminal offense in this state. The entire legal foundation of Courtney's desperate ambush disintegrated into dust under the crushing weight of Bradley's preparation. She had brought a fabricated sob story to a gunfight, completely ignorant of the fact that I had been building my legal fortress long before she even dialed the emergency hotline. The air grew thick with tension as the officers slowly lowered their hands from their holstered weapons and turned their attention away from my wheelchair. The lead officer folded Bradley's airtight documentation and turned slowly on his heavy boots, fixing a cold, unforgiving glare entirely on Courtney. The sympathetic demeanor he had offered her just moments ago vanished, replaced by the rigid, imposing authority of a law enforcement professional who realized he had been played for an absolute fool. Courtney physically recoiled, the theatrical tears drying instantly on her cheeks as a wave of genuine, paralyzing terror washed over her perfectly manicured features. She opened her mouth to speak desperately, stammering out a fragmented, incoherent defense. She attempted to backtrack, claiming she had merely been concerned for my safety, that she might have overreacted to a simple family misunderstanding. The officer did not entertain her pathetic retreat. He signaled his partner, who unclipped a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt and marched aggressively across the manicured grass. Courtney screamed in piercing disbelief as the officer grabbed her wrists forcefully, twisting her arms behind her back. The sharp metallic ratcheting of the cuffs locking into place echoed loudly across the quiet suburban street, drawing the attention of curious neighbors peering through their blinds. Right there on the front lawn of the estate she had tried to steal, the officer began reading Courtney her Miranda rights in a loud, monotone voice. He informed her that she had the right to remain silent, a right she should have exercised long before trying to outsmart me. Her designer heels dug furiously into the turf as she thrashed against the officers, her meticulously crafted high society image shattering into absolute primitive panic. They forcefully shoved her into the cramped, unforgiving back seat of the police cruiser, slamming the heavy door shut and trapping her behind thick wire mesh. Aaron stood frozen just a few feet away, completely immobilized by fear, watching his arrogant wife be reduced to a common criminal. Aaron did not have the luxury of mourning his wife's brutal public arrest. Before the police cruiser could even shift into drive and pull away from the curb, a sharp, aggressive vibration erupted from Aaron's pocket. His cellular phone rang with a relentless, piercing tone that cut through the chaotic aftermath on the lawn. He pulled the device out with trembling fingers, staring at the blocked caller ID with a look of pure, unadulterated dread. The violent underground syndicate he owed $1.5 million had finally run out of patience. They did not leave a threatening voicemail or offer another generous extension to their desperate debtor. Their response was immediate and violently physical. From the dark, unlit street beyond my property line, a heavy object hurtled through the damp night air. A solid masonry brick slammed violently into the pristine windshield of Courtney's luxury SUV parked in my driveway. The deafening crash of shattering safety glass caused the remaining officers to flinch and drop their hands back to their service weapons, scanning the dark perimeter for unseen threats. The heavy brick punched a massive, jagged crater directly through the driver's side window, sending hundreds of crystalline shards cascading across the expensive leather seats. A coarse piece of dirty twine was tightly wrapped around the center of the brick, securing a crumpled, grease-stained piece of paper. The message scrawled across the torn paper in thick black marker consisted of 3 chilling words: "Time is up." The mob enforcers were no longer hiding in the shadows of the city's port district. They had tracked Aaron directly to the estate, demonstrating with terrifying clarity that his fabricated corporate lifestyle was officially over. The invisible wall protecting him from the criminal underworld had collapsed. They did not care about the police presence or his domestic failures. They only cared about extracting their payment, and they were willing to extract it in blood. The deafening sound of the shattering glass broke the last remaining thread of Aaron's fragile sanity. The arrogant tech CEO who had spent years manipulating my finances and plotting my demise completely folded under the crushing weight of his own deadly choices. His legs gave out beneath him and he collapsed heavily onto the damp grass, falling to his knees just inches from the rubber wheels of my chair. He abandoned every shred of his pride, burying his face in his hands and sobbing with the raw, pathetic desperation of a man staring directly into his own open grave. He reached out his sweating, trembling fingers, clutching desperately at the fabric of my trousers, and begged me to authorize the immediate release of $1.5 million. He pleaded for his life, insisting with ragged breaths that the mob enforcers would butcher him before the sun came up if I did not liquidate the Martha Trust immediately. When I looked down at him with an expression of absolute, unyielding stone, his survival instinct mutated into pure, treacherous cowardice. He began to frantically shift the blame for every single atrocity they had committed against me. He pointed a shaking finger toward the police cruiser fading into the distance, screaming that Courtney was the malicious mastermind behind the entire operation. He cried out that his wife had systematically manipulated his mind, planting the poisonous idea to seize the estate from the very beginning. He explicitly claimed that Courtney was the one who forced his hand in the basement, commanding him to push me down those concrete stairs so they could finally cash out and escape their debts. My own son was publicly confessing to attempted murder in a desperate bid to paint himself as a brainwashed victim. The devastating depths of his betrayal were finally laid bare, setting the stage for my ultimate judgment. I looked down at my son groveling on the damp grass. Aaron clutched desperately at the fabric of my trousers, his face slick with sweat and tears, begging for $1.5 million to appease the violent men hunting him. He was no longer the arrogant tech executive who had shoved me down a flight of concrete stairs. He was a pathetic, terrified shell of a man willing to trade his own wife for a chance at survival. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. My heart, which had broken the night he left me bleeding in the dark, was now forged into something unyielding. I pulled my leg back, forcing his desperate hands to slip off my clothes. I looked him dead in the eye and told him he would not see a single cent of my money. I explained with absolute clarity that I had spent 40 years breaking my back on construction sites to build a legacy of honor and hard work. I refused to let my life savings fund the survival of a coward. He had happily pushed me into the darkness to solve his financial rot, and the moment the consequences caught up with him, he immediately threw his wife to the wolves to save his own skin. I told Aaron that a man who betrays his father for a payout and sells out his wife for a lifeline deserves whatever violent fate the criminal underworld has prepared for him. I would not bail out a monster. The absolute finality in my voice drained the last bit of color from his face. He knelt there in the dark, completely broken, realizing that his lifetime supply of unconditional forgiveness had permanently expired. Bradley stepped forward out of the shadows, moving with the lethal precision of a legal executioner. He reached inside his tailored jacket and produced a thick, professionally bound document printed on heavy stock paper. He did not offer any sympathetic words as he dropped the legal packet directly onto the grass in front of Aaron. Bradley informed him that the document was a formal, irrevocable notice of complete disinheritance. I had instructed Bradley to activate the bad actor provision I had secretly woven into the foundation of the Martha Trust 10 years ago. That specific clause mandated the immediate and permanent excision of any beneficiary convicted of or implicated in a violent crime against the trust founder. Aaron stared at the paper as if it were a venomous snake. Bradley brutally clarified the legal reality. Every single tie connecting Aaron to my wealth, my properties, and my legacy was permanently severed. He was no longer a designated heir. He was no longer a proxy. In the eyes of the law and the estate, Aaron was officially a total stranger. He possessed zero legal standing to claim a single brick of the house he had tried to steal. The sheer magnitude of his loss crushed the remaining breath from his lungs. He had gambled his entire bloodline for a quick payout from the mob and ended up entirely erased from our family history. Bradley advised Aaron to take the documents and leave the property immediately, warning him that his presence was now legally classified as criminal trespassing. Aaron slowly picked up the heavy packet, his hands trembling violently. He stumbled backward into the dark, entirely cut off from the fortress of wealth he had destroyed his soul to acquire. The following morning brought a tense, heavy silence to the estate. The sun was barely rising over the manicured lawn when the heavy brass knocker on my front door echoed through the house. Courtney had utilized her last shred of personal credit to secure a bail bondsman and release herself from the county holding cell. She knew exactly what kind of violent men were actively hunting her husband. Fully aware that Aaron was effectively marked for death by the underground syndicate, she calculated her next move with the same ruthless self-preservation she had always possessed. She did not come to my house to apologize or to beg for forgiveness for her actions. She bypassed the damaged front door and quietly slipped into my private study. I was sitting behind my heavy mahogany desk waiting for her. Her high society facade was entirely gone. Her designer clothes were wrinkled from a night in police custody, and her eyes darted nervously around the room, assessing the environment like a cornered predator. She took a seat in the leather chair opposite my desk, leaning forward with a look of desperate, calculating intensity. Courtney bluntly stated that her marriage to Aaron was over. She had no intention of sinking with his ruined ship or catching a stray bullet from the mob enforcers closing in on his location. Instead, she offered me a treacherous, highly illegal proposition. She was willing to sell her husband out completely to secure her own survival, proving that the foundation of their high-profile relationship was built entirely on mutual parasitism. She looked me directly in the eyes and prepared to name her specific price for sending my son to a state penitentiary. Courtney laid her treacherous cards on the heavy wooden desk without an ounce of hesitation. She offered to march directly into criminal court and testify under oath that Aaron had meticulously planned the attempted murder in the basement. She promised to provide the district attorney with every timeline, every motive, and every shred of financial desperation that drove him to push me down those concrete stairs. Her testimony would guarantee him a maximum sentence, entirely removing him from my life for good. In exchange for delivering this lethal legal weapon, she demanded $500,000 in untraceable cash and a first-class one-way ticket completely out of the country. She wanted to use my wealth to build a new life far away from the mob and the wreckage of her marriage. I sat perfectly still, letting her toxic proposition hang in the quiet air of the study. I looked at the woman who had complained about my blood ruining her designer shoes, now eagerly auctioning off her husband's freedom. I did not express outrage. I did not yell or command her to leave my home. Instead, I slowly reached across the polished mahogany surface of my desk. I pressed a single glowing silver button on the base of my multi-line office telephone. The digital speakerphone instantly lit up, emitting a soft electronic hum that cut through the tension. I had called Aaron 5 minutes before Courtney walked into the room. The line had been open the entire time. A sickening, hollow silence filled the study as Courtney stared at the glowing green light on the console. Through the speaker, Aaron's ragged, devastated breathing echoed in the room. He had just listened to his wife sell his life for $500,000. Aaron crashed through the heavy double doors of my study with the force of a battering ram. He had sprinted from wherever he had parked his vehicle, driven by pure, unadulterated betrayal. The polished veneer of the successful tech executive completely evaporated, leaving behind a rabid, cornered animal. He lunged across the expensive Persian rug, his hands outstretched like desperate claws, aiming directly for the woman who had just sold his life. The heavy leather chair Courtney occupied tipped violently backward as the sheer force of his tackle sent them both crashing onto the hardwood floor. The pristine, highly curated illusion of their elite high society marriage instantly disintegrated into raw, primitive violence. Courtney shrieked a high and piercing sound of genuine terror as Aaron pinned her against the polished floorboards. He screamed hoarse, spit-flecked accusations directly into her face, agonizingly detailing the reality of hearing her auction off his freedom for a plane ticket. She wildly swung her hands in defense, her expensive acrylic nails tearing deep, bloody scratches down the side of his neck. They rolled violently across the floor, knocking over a heavy mahogany side table and shattering a crystal reading lamp into 100 jagged pieces. Aaron grabbed the lapels of her wrinkled designer jacket, shaking her with enough force to rattle her teeth, entirely consumed by the realization that he had sacrificed his own blood for a woman who viewed him as a highly disposable asset. The tailored suits and the country club etiquette were completely stripped away in an instant. They were two desperate parasites fighting over a rotting carcass, destroying each other in a feral bid for survival. I sat perfectly motionless behind my desk, watching the absolute destruction of their unholy alliance unfold exactly as I had orchestrated. Courtney violently shoved her knee into Aaron's chest, kicking him hard enough to break his furious grip. Scrambling backward against the towering oak bookshelves, she unleashed a torrent of venomous, racially charged insults that exposed the absolute rotting core of her character. She spat a small amount of blood from her bitten lip and screamed that she had always utterly despised him. She tore mercilessly into his heritage, viciously attacking the working-class black roots I had fought so fiercely to instill in him. She called him a pathetic, low-level street hustler playing dress-up in a sophisticated world where he would never truly belong. She shrieked that she was physically sick to her stomach from pretending to tolerate his family, describing my hard-earned estate as a pathetic, tasteless monument to peasant labor. The sheer, unfiltered vitriol echoing off the study walls confirmed every silent suspicion I had ever harbored about her elitist nature. She did not merely look down upon our lack of generational wealth. She harbored a deep systemic disgust for our very existence. She weaponized every private insecurity Aaron had ever foolishly confided in her, explicitly mocking his desperate, pathetic attempts to seamlessly blend into her pristine, old-money social circles. She laughed with a manic, unhinged energy, wiping smeared makeup and blood from her chin, stating he was nothing but a highly useful idiot who had served his sole purpose the moment he financed her luxurious lifestyle. Aaron stood completely frozen, the sharp physical pain of his bleeding neck eclipsed entirely by the absolute psychological devastation of her vile words. He had abandoned his culture, his father, and his own fundamental identity to desperately seek validation from a woman who viewed his very genetics as an unforgivable stain on her pedigree. The brutal, unvarnished truth hung heavily in the suffocating air, leaving Aaron utterly hollowed out. I did not intervene in their grotesque display of mutual destruction or attempt to silence their screaming. I calmly reached beneath the thick edge of my mahogany desk and pressed my thumb firmly against the concealed security panic button, which was hardwired directly to the local police precinct. Within less than 5 minutes, the wailing, high-pitched sirens of multiple approaching squad cars shattered the early morning suburban quiet of the neighborhood. The heavy thudding boots of several armed officers pounded across the front porch, rushing straight through the still shattered front doorway and charging urgently into my study. They immediately discovered Aaron and Courtney locked in a desperate second wave of violent grappling, trading brutal, uncoordinated strikes on the floor, surrounded by broken crystal and scattered financial paperwork. The officers shouted aggressive, deafening commands, physically prying the two rabid combatants apart with overwhelming force. They slammed Aaron face first against the nearest bookshelf, forcefully wrenching his arms behind his back as they secured the heavy metal handcuffs tightly around his wrists. Two other officers tackled a wildly thrashing Courtney to the Persian rug, completely ignoring her hysterical screams of victimhood and entitlement as they firmly locked her in tight steel restraints. Both of them were breathing heavily, their expensive clothes completely ruined and covered in sweat dirt and their own smeared blood. The police officers forcefully dragged the screaming combative couple out of my study, hauling them down the hallway like feral animals caught trespassing in a civilized home. Courtney shrieked desperately, kicking her designer heels against the wooden doorframe and demanding to call her high-priced lawyer, while Aaron simply hung his head in absolute heavy defeat, his spirit entirely shattered. I remained seated peacefully in my wheelchair behind the desk, watching the flashing red and blue lights paint the walls of my study as the officers shoved them into the back of separate patrol vehicles. The chaotic, violent removal finally restored a profound sense of absolute tranquility to my home. The lead police officer returned to my study a few moments later, pulling a small official notepad from his heavy utility belt. He respectfully asked if I wished to press formal domestic violence and property damage charges against my son and daughter-in-law for the chaotic, bloody brawl that had just ruined my personal space. I looked at the broken crystal lamp and the deeply scratched hardwood floor, then slowly shook my head with a calm, deliberate certainty. I explicitly declined to file any formal charges, informing the perplexed officer that holding them in a highly secure county jail cell would actually be an act of profound, undeserved mercy. Locking them safely behind reinforced iron bars would provide them with a heavily guarded sanctuary entirely insulated from the severe, deadly consequences of their catastrophic financial crimes. I wanted them immediately released back into the unforgiving, dangerous reality they had so arrogantly created. The officer accepted my legal decision without further argument, signaling his team to drive away and officially dumping the pair back onto the harsh city streets long before sunset. Without the immense protection of my wealth or the temporary safety of a holding cell, Aaron was left completely exposed and highly vulnerable. Late that exact night, the heavy silence of the city's grim industrial district was abruptly broken by the low rumbling engine of a matte black unmarked utility van. It glided slowly onto the unlit street and parked directly outside the cheap temporary apartment building Aaron had desperately of professional executioners. They easily bypassed the faulty security gate and breached his flimsy apartment door without making a single sound. Aaron did not even have the brief opportunity to scream for help. The invisible underworld he foolishly thought he could outsmart simply swallowed him whole in the dark, dragging him violently into the back of the waiting van and vanishing without a trace into the night. The secure landline on my mahogany desk rang precisely at 2 o'clock in the morning. I knew exactly who was calling. I lifted the heavy receiver and was greeted by a voice entirely devoid of emotion, a cold, gravelly tone belonging to a man who managed violence like a corporate spreadsheet. The caller bypassed any introduction, stating simply that the price for my son's continued breathing had just increased to $2 million. The additional $500,000 was a strict penalty for the inconvenience of extracting him from the city. As the man spoke, my personal cell phone buzzed with an incoming encrypted message. I opened the screen to find a high-resolution photograph. Aaron was strapped tightly to a rusted metal chair in the center of a cavernous, dimly lit industrial warehouse. His designer clothes were torn and heavily stained with dirt and his own blood. One of his eyes was swollen completely shut, and his jaw hung slack in an expression of absolute primitive terror. A large, faceless man stood behind him, resting the barrel of a heavy firearm casually against the back of Aaron's skull. The caller gave me exactly 1 hour to secure the cash and arrive at the designated coordinates, warning me that a single police siren would result in Aaron's immediate execution. I stared at the digital image of the boy I had raised, feeling an absolute void where my paternal instincts used to reside. I did not panic, nor did I attempt to negotiate. I simply told the man on the phone that I would arrive shortly, hanging up the receiver with a steady hand. I was not bringing a single cent of my hard-earned wealth to buy the freedom of a treacherous coward. I immediately dialed Bradley on his encrypted private line, bypassing any pleasantries. I instructed him to completely ignore our liquid assets and instead access the deepest tier of our corporate archives. I demanded a very specific, heavily sealed property deed drawn up by one of our most obscured shell corporations. Bradley did not question the unorthodox request. He arrived at my estate within 20 minutes, handing me a thick leather portfolio containing the exact legal ammunition I required. I took the portfolio, dismissed my security detail, and climbed into the driver's seat of my reinforced sedan. Every movement sent white-hot spikes of agony radiating up my fractured spine, but I buried the physical pain beneath a wall of absolute resolve. I drove alone through the deserted city streets, navigating toward the decaying industrial sector near the shipping ports. The designated location was a sprawling, neglected manufacturing warehouse surrounded by a high chain-link fence topped with rusted razor wire. I parked my sedan directly in front of the heavy corrugated steel doors, killed the engine, and stepped out into the freezing night air. I gripped my wooden cane, using it to stabilize my damaged back, and pushed the heavy metal door open. The interior smelled intensely of motor oil, damp concrete, and stale cigarette smoke. 4 massive enforcers immediately stepped out of the shadows, their hands resting menacingly on the grips of their holstered weapons. They expected a terrified, weeping father carrying a heavy duffel bag full of cash. I gave them zero satisfaction. I walked past the armed guards without breaking my stride, projecting an aura of absolute terrifying fearlessness as I marched directly toward the center of the warehouse where my son was tied to the chair. A sharply dressed man with cold, dead eyes sat casually at a rusted metal table opposite my son. He was the architect of the extortion the mob boss who mistakenly believed he held the ultimate leverage. He watched me approach, a smug, victorious smirk playing across his face as he extended an open hand, demanding the $2 million in raw cash. Aaron sobbed pathetically in the background, pleading through a bloody mouth for me to pay the men and save his life. I did not acknowledge my son. I stopped directly in front of the metal table, looked the boss dead in the eye, and forcefully slapped the thick leather portfolio onto the rusted surface. I instructed him to open it. The man frowned, his smirk faltering slightly as he flipped back the leather cover and examined the heavy wax-sealed parchment inside. He expected bearer bonds or certified bank drafts. Instead, he found the original, unencumbered deed to the massive industrial property we were currently standing in. I informed him in a voice devoid of any warmth that my obscured shell corporation had quietly purchased this warehouse along with the entire surrounding block 7 years ago. He was running a highly illegal multi-million-dollar smuggling and money laundering operation on property that I completely owned and controlled. The color rapidly drained from the man's face as his eyes darted across the official state seals and the irrefutable property boundaries detailed on the paper. The immense violent power he thought he wielded inside this building instantly evaporated. I was not a desperate father trespassing in a criminal den. He was a vulnerable squatter operating a massive felony enterprise directly inside the walls of my personal domain. I did not allow the mob boss a single second to recover from the devastating revelation. I leaned heavily on my cane and calmly informed him of the catastrophic failsafe I had activated before leaving my estate. The reinforced sedan parked right outside his front door was equipped with a military-grade GPS tracker actively monitored by a private security firm. I explained that the firm had explicit, unbreakable instructions to instantly transmit my location and a comprehensive dossier of the mob's entire laundering operation directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation if my vital signs dropped, or if I failed to return home within the hour. If his men pulled a trigger, my property would instantly become the epicenter of a massive federal crime scene. The entire industrial block would be seized under federal racketeering laws before sunrise, permanently obliterating his syndicate's infrastructure. The boss stared at me in absolute silence, the brutal reality of his total checkmate crushing the air from his lungs. He realized that pulling a weapon on me was financial and legal suicide. I turned my attention to Aaron, who was staring at me with wide, horrified eyes, finally comprehending that I had not come to rescue him. I looked back at the syndicate boss and explicitly stated that my son's staggering debt was entirely his own problem. I suggested they put Aaron to work letting him scrub floors or move heavy cargo until every single cent of the $2 million was paid off in grueling manual labor. I turned my back on the armed enforcers, ignoring Aaron's agonizing, desperate screams echoing through the damp warehouse, and walked out into the cold night air, leaving my greatest mistake behind me forever. Exactly 14 days after the unmarked utility van swallowed him into the city's criminal underbelly, Aaron returned to my property. He dragged his battered body up the long, winding asphalt driveway, moving with an agonizing, heavily pronounced limp. His right leg was encased in a thick fiberglass cast, thoroughly soaked and stained with street grime. The syndicate enforcers had not ended his life in that damp warehouse. Death would have been a rapid release from his debts, and the mob did not operate on mercy. They chose to extract their $2 million by systematically dismantling everything he valued. They kept him chained to a concrete pillar, subjecting him to grueling physical torment until his spirit was completely obliterated. Once they broke his body, they brought in their own corrupt attorneys. Aaron was forced to sign over the entirety of his tech startup, transferring his patents, his proprietary software, and every single corporate asset to a series of untraceable shell companies. The business he had built to fund his arrogant, high society lifestyle was ripped from his bleeding hands. Having seized his company and shattered his leg as a permanent reminder of his failures, the enforcers brutally dumped him in a random alleyway before dawn. He spent hours dragging himself through the unforgiving city streets, navigating the pouring rain with absolutely no money, no phone, and no allies. His tailored suit was torn into dirty rags clinging wetly to his bruised ribs. He stumbled toward my estate because he had absolutely nowhere else to go. His pride had been entirely eradicated, replaced by the primal, desperate instinct of a freezing animal seeking its former shelter. Aaron finally reached the heavy concrete steps of the front porch, pulling his dead weight up the railing with grunts of intense physical exertion. The torrential rain battered his shoulders as he collapsed against the front entrance. The brutally splintered wooden frame he had destroyed weeks prior was entirely gone. In its place stood a massive reinforced security door equipped with heavy iron deadbolts and thick shatterproof glass panels. Aaron reached into his soaked pocket with trembling, bloody fingers and produced his spare house key. He desperately jammed the jagged metal into the keyhole, attempting to force it to turn. The key refused to slide into the cylinder. The internal brass mechanisms had been completely replaced. He yanked the handle aggressively, but the heavy door did not budge a fraction of an inch. Defeated, he leaned his wet forehead against the cold glass, his eyes darting frantically across the property. Through the sheets of driving rain, his gaze locked onto the edge of the street. Stacked haphazardly along the wet concrete curb sat 36 heavy black industrial garbage bags. The harsh winds had torn several of the plastic bags open, spilling their contents directly into the muddy gutters. Aaron recognized a ruined pair of Courtney's expensive designer heels floating in a puddle alongside the waterlogged remnants of his custom-tailored Italian suits. Every single item they had left inside my house, every piece of expensive clothing, every piece of jewelry, and every curated artifact of their fraudulent upper-class existence had been swept up and unceremoniously discarded like common refuse. Their entire life together was sitting in the mud, completely ruined by the relentless storm. A visceral wave of absolute panic washed over Aaron as the reality of his permanent exile set in. He balled his bruised hands into tight fists and began pounding aggressively against the thick, reinforced glass of the front door. The heavy thuds vibrated against the frame, accompanied by his hoarse, ragged screams. He begged for shelter, crying out for me to open the door and grant him a sliver of mercy. He pleaded for a warm room, a dry towel, and a second chance to explain his horrific actions. I stood in the warmly lit foyer just a few feet away from the heavy glass barrier, perfectly upright. I leaned a fraction of my weight onto my polished wooden cane, holding a steaming mug of black coffee in my opposite hand. The rich aroma of the dark roast filled the dry, quiet air of my home. I took a slow, deliberate sip, staring directly through the rain-streaked window at the pathetic, shivering creature begging on my porch. I did not utter a single word. I did not flinch at his desperate cries or reach for the heavy iron deadbolt. The boundary between us was drawn in impenetrable stone. 40 years of unconditional paternal love had been permanently extinguished the moment he left me bleeding on the basement floor. He was looking for the compassionate father he had manipulated for decades, but that man no longer existed. He was staring at the executor of the Martha Trust, a man who viewed him as nothing more than a trespassing stranger. I stood in the warm light of my fortress, calmly drinking my coffee, and watched the freezing rain wash mercilessly over my former son. While Aaron continued his pathetic assault on the reinforced glass, the sputtering engine of a badly rusted, dilapidated sedan cut through the sound of the heavy rain. The beaten vehicle swerved erratically toward the curb, parking dangerously close to the massive pile of black garbage bags. Courtney sat behind the steering wheel, her hair wet and matted, her face completely devoid of its usual expensive cosmetics. She had exhausted her funds posting bail and had clearly stolen the junk car from a dark city lot, desperately intending to salvage her luxury handbags and designer coats. before the weather destroyed them entirely. She threw the driver's side door open entirely, ignoring the sight of her crippled husband weeping on my front porch. She dropped to her knees in the mud, frantically ripping at the wet plastic bags to extract her ruined belongings. She was so entirely consumed by her own material greed that she failed to notice the local police cruiser silently turning onto the street. The patrol car's automated license plate reader instantly flagged the stolen plates on the rusted sedan. Without warning, the blinding red and blue strobe lights ignited the dark, rainy street. 2 armed officers leaped from the cruiser into the downpour, unholstering their service weapons and barking aggressive commands. They ordered Courtney to drop the muddy designer coats and put her hands firmly behind her head. A 3rd officer charged up my driveway, grabbing Aaron by the collar of his soaked shirt and dragging him down the concrete stairs. The police forced both of them face down into the wet grass, clicking cold steel handcuffs around their wrists. The ultimate trap closed tightly around them, permanently securing their shared descent into absolute ruin. The brief stint in the county holding cell did nothing to humble my son. While fighting the severe criminal charges stemming from his arrest in the stolen vehicle, Aaron found himself completely devoid of personal resources, forcing him to rely on an overworked public defender. However, desperation breeds a profound level of audacity. Facing the terrifying prospect of a lengthy prison sentence and total financial ruin, Aaron orchestrated one final pathetic legal maneuver. He managed to convince his court-appointed attorney to file a massive civil lawsuit directly against me. The fraudulent legal petition arrived at my estate via certified mail, claiming severe emotional distress and childhood neglect. Aaron formally argued that my supposed absence and lack of emotional support had directly caused his deep psychological trauma, which subsequently led to his catastrophic financial failures and criminal actions. He was actively attempting to legally blame me for his own sociopathic greed and complete lack of personal accountability. The frivolous lawsuit demanded a staggering 50% of the Martha Trust's total assets as mandatory restitution for his fabricated lifelong suffering. He firmly believed that the sheer annoyance of a drawn-out, highly publicized civil battle would force me into offering a quiet multi-million-dollar cash settlement just to make him go away. He assumed I would pay a ransom to protect my reputation from being dragged through the mud of a family court dispute. He severely miscalculated my threshold for patience and my absolute willingness to expose his lies in front of a sitting judge. The day of the preliminary hearing arrived with heavy gray skies. I sat completely motionless in my wheelchair beside Bradley at the polished mahogany defense table, projecting an aura of absolute calm. Aaron took the witness stand dressed in a cheap, ill-fitting suit borrowed from a discount rack, leaning heavily on the crutches supporting his shattered leg. He immediately launched into a highly theatrical performance, perfectly mimicking the hysterical victimhood Courtney had displayed on my front lawn. He looked at the presiding judge and described a cold, emotionally barren childhood filled with isolation. He spun a tragic narrative of a completely absent father who relentlessly prioritized pouring concrete and building commercial real estate empires over raising his only child. He painted a vivid picture of a boy left entirely to his own devices, starved of basic paternal affection, and forced to navigate a harsh world without any guidance or emotional safety net. He actually managed to shed a few genuine tears, wiping his face as he claimed that my obsessive pursuit of wealth had directly fractured his mental health, pushing him into a life of desperate financial validation just to earn my approval. It was a masterclass in shifting accountability and weaponizing therapy terminology to justify his own treacherous actions. He sat back in the witness chair looking like a broken, deeply wounded man seeking long overdue justice from a tyrant. Bradley did not interrupt him once during the entire pathetic monologue. We simply let him dig his own grave as deep as he possibly could. When it was time for cross-examination, Bradley stood up and calmly approached the judge's bench. He did not offer a passionate, emotional rebuttal, nor did he waste a single breath arguing about the subjective nature of my parenting style. He simply carried 2 massive, heavy cardboard boxes and set them deliberately onto the polished wooden floor. Bradley reached inside and unloaded exactly 500 pages of meticulously cataloged, legally certified bank transfers and financial records. He systematically walked the stunned courtroom through every single document, dismantling Aaron's tragic narrative with cold, irrefutable mathematics. Bradley presented the cleared receipts for Aaron's elite private academy tuition, fully paid in cash for 12 consecutive years. He submitted the verified bank drafts for his 4-year degree at a top-tier university, proving that I had absorbed every cent of the cost, leaving Aaron entirely debt-free upon graduation. He produced the original title transfer for Aaron's very first luxury vehicle, a graduation present I had purchased outright. Finally, Bradley dropped the ultimate piece of physical evidence onto the table, the certified bank wire confirming the initial $500,000 seed capital I had personally transferred to Aaron to launch his tech startup. Bradley looked directly at my son, his voice echoing sharply across the quiet room. He asked Aaron to explain to the court exactly how a supposedly neglectful, entirely absent father had somehow managed to single-handedly finance a life of absolute elite financial privilege, from kindergarten through corporate adulthood. The devastating paper trail laid bare the staggering extent of my sacrifice, instantly crushing Aaron's emotional lies under an impenetrable mountain of hard data. The judge spent precisely 4 minutes reviewing the mountain of undeniable financial evidence before immediately halting the proceedings. The entire civil case was thrown out with extreme prejudice. The judge leaned over the heavy wooden bench and delivered a scathing, highly publicized verbal reprimand, expressing absolute disgust at Aaron's blatant attempt to weaponize the civil court system to extort his father. Furthermore, the judge issued a severe financial sanction directly against Aaron's hapless public defender for willingly filing a completely frivolous and baseless lawsuit without conducting a single shred of basic discovery. Aaron slumped deeply into the witness chair, his face entirely drained of color. His last desperate grab for my wealth had been pulverized by cold, hard facts. His legal avenues were entirely exhausted, his public credibility was permanently destroyed, and his impending criminal trials loomed over him like an executioner's axe. He was out of maneuvers, out of money, and completely out of time. However, Courtney was sitting in the back row of the gallery watching the total collapse of their legal extortion strategy with calculating eyes. Realizing that the official court system was an impenetrable dead end and that her husband was entirely useless, she refused to surrender her delusion of ultimate victory. If she could not legally force me to liquidate the Martha Trust, she decided to destroy my legacy through alternative means. Out of legal options, Courtney turned to her final, most destructive weapon. She quietly exited the courtroom, pulling her phone from her pocket and preparing to wage an unregulated, vicious war in the volatile court of public opinion. Courtney retreated to a cheap, dimly lit motel room paid for by a sympathetic, easily manipulated former college friend. Stripped of her expensive designer wardrobe and facing rapidly mounting legal bills, she immediately activated the high-definition camera on her smartphone. She understood with terrifying clarity that in the modern digital age, the objective truth was entirely secondary to a compelling narrative of absolute victimhood. With meticulous predatory precision, she crafted a highly edited, deeply emotional video specifically designed to ignite a massive firestorm of public outrage. She purposefully removed all her makeup to appear exhausted, battered, and thoroughly defeated, forcing hot tears to stream continuously down her cheeks as she stared directly into the camera lens. In a voice trembling with fabricated trauma, she openly accused me of being a tyrannical, sociopathic billionaire who sadistically controlled his entire family through weaponized financial abuse. She spun a devastating, entirely fictional tale of how I had systematically hoarded my massive wealth, deliberately starving my own flesh and blood just to watch them suffer for my own sick amusement. She described Aaron's descent into criminal desperation not as an act of immense personal greed, but as the tragic, inevitable result of my profound emotional neglect. She claimed that I had violently thrown them out onto the unforgiving streets during a torrential rainstorm, leaving her allegedly pregnant and destitute without a single cent to her name. She conveniently omitted the mob debts, the stolen vehicle, the bribery, and the attempted murder. The narrative was meticulously structured to paint me as the ultimate corporate villain and herself as the helpless, innocent martyr crushed beneath the boot of extreme capitalism. She uploaded the video across every major social media platform, aggressively tagging local news outlets, social justice influencers, and viral commentary channels, knowing exactly how to feed the insatiable algorithm. The internet responded exactly as Courtney had maliciously anticipated. Within 24 hours, the tearful video had accumulated over 10 million views, completely dominating the local and national digital news cycles. The algorithm rapidly amplified her fabricated trauma, transforming her into an overnight symbol of the oppressed working class fighting against corrupt dynastic wealth. The public backlash against the Martha Trust and my personal reputation was immediate, ferocious, and highly coordinated. Angry mobs mobilized by outrage influencers began staging loud, highly disruptive protests outside my premier commercial properties. They held up aggressive, hastily painted signs labeling me a corporate monster and physically blocked the main entrances to my corporate headquarters, screaming through megaphones. The sheer volume of digital hostility quickly bled into the massive financial reality of my business operations. Several of my highly lucrative anchor commercial tenants, terrified of the intense public relations nightmare and the associated consumer boycotts, contacted Bradley's office to formally threaten breaking their multi-million-dollar long-term leases. My corporate inbox was instantly flooded with thousands of hateful messages, vicious death threats, and aggressive demands for my immediate resignation from the board of my own company. Courtney's strategy was brutally transparent. She was deliberately destroying my hard-earned public legacy, systematically burning down my entire business empire to force me to the negotiating table. Her attorney released a smug public statement heavily implying that a generous multi-million-dollar financial settlement would result in the immediate removal of the video and a highly publicized staged family reconciliation. She firmly believed that the staggering financial losses from vacating commercial tenants and the absolute destruction of my social standing would force me to capitulate and buy her permanent silence. She assumed that a man who had spent 40 years building an impeccable reputation would pay absolutely any price to protect it from a digital lynch mob. Bradley urgently advised me to hire an elite, highly expensive crisis management firm to draft a standard sanitized public relations apology. He presented a comprehensive mitigation strategy that involved issuing a carefully worded press release, making a substantial charitable donation to a domestic abuse organization, and offering Courtney a highly confidential non-disclosure agreement explicitly disguised as a generous severance package. I looked at the panicked corporate advisors sitting around my heavy mahogany conference table and absolutely refused to engage in their cowardly submissive tactics. I made it explicitly clear that I would never offer a single word of apology for surviving an assassination attempt, nor would I ever negotiate with a domestic terrorist wielding a smartphone camera. Submitting to her digital extortion would only validate her vicious lies and invite an endless string of future financial demands. Instead of retreating into the corporate shadows or issuing a pathetic ghost-written statement, I chose to completely bypass the traditional media filters and confront the entire city on my own uncompromising terms. I instructed Bradley to immediately contact the senior executives of the leading local television news network. Utilizing the sheer overwhelming financial weight of the Martha Trust, I forcefully purchased an uninterrupted 10-minute block of premium commercial airtime scheduled directly during their highly viewed evening broadcast. The network executives initially hesitated, completely unsure of my unprecedented intentions, but the exorbitant non-refundable cash payment instantly silenced their ethical concerns. I did not hire a scriptwriter to craft a defense. I did not hire a sympathetic spokesperson or a slick defense attorney to plead my case to the angry public. I simply handed Bradley 2 highly encrypted digital storage drives and told him to deliver them directly to the broadcasting control room under heavy security. I was going to leverage the very attention Courtney had desperately generated to execute her total public annihilation. At exactly 8 o'clock that evening, the local news broadcast abruptly cut away from its scheduled programming. Millions of viewers across the entire city, heavily primed by days of relentless social media outrage, leaned toward their television screens, entirely expecting to see a groveling, defeated billionaire begging for public forgiveness. The screen faded from black, but I did not appear on camera. I did not offer a single spoken word in my own defense. Instead, the broadcast instantly played the pristine, high-definition security footage captured in my basement weeks ago. The unedited, crystal-clear video explicitly showed Aaron's face contorted in violent rage as he aggressively shoved me backward down the steep concrete staircase. The harsh, sickening sound of my body violently impacting the cement steps echoed through every living room in the city, providing undeniable, horrific proof of his calculated, attempted patricide. Before the shocked audience could even process the sheer brutality of the unprovoked attack, the screen transitioned to a stark, solid, black background displaying a simple, glowing green audio waveform. The broadcast then played the crystal-clear, unedited recording secretly captured by my office speakerphone. Courtney's arrogant, venomous voice filled the public airwaves. every single citizen heard her explicitly offer to provide lethal fabricated testimony to send her own husband to a maximum security state penitentiary. They heard her shamelessly demand $500,000 in untraceable cash and a first-class ticket out of the country in direct exchange for his complete and total destruction. The entire city sat in absolute stunned silence as the undeniable reality of her sociopathic greed completely shattered her carefully constructed victim narrative. The broadcast simply ended, cutting back to regular programming without a single closing remark or explanation. Courtney had demanded the undivided attention of the public court, and I had just handed the jury the undeniable evidence of her absolute treachery. The digital landscape shifted with neck-snapping velocity. The exact same outrage influencers and social justice advocates who had spent the last 48 hours demanding my corporate crucifixion instantly deleted their previous posts in a panicked scramble to save their own credibility. The 10-minute broadcast acted as a digital guillotine, publicly decapitating Courtney's meticulously crafted victim narrative with brutal efficiency. The unedited footage of my violent fall down the basement stairs and the damning audio of her extortion demand spread like wildfire across every major social media platform, generating millions of views within a matter of minutes. The comment sections that had previously overflowed with hateful death threats directed at my estate were rapidly replaced by a unified, ferocious demand for swift and merciless justice against my son and daughter-in-law. They were no longer viewed as the tragic martyrs of the working class. They were instantly branded as calculating sociopathic predators who had brazenly attempted to manipulate the public into facilitating a massive extortion scheme. The angry mobs that had blockaded my corporate headquarters evaporated into the night, heavily demoralized and utterly humiliated by their own gullibility. My commercial tenants immediately retracted their lease termination threats, replacing them with frantic emails apologizing for their premature judgments and reaffirming their loyalty to the Martha Trust. The overwhelming weight of public fury shifted directly onto the local police department and the district attorney's office. Citizens flooded emergency dispatch lines, aggressively demanding to know why the two individuals caught on national television orchestrating an attempted murder and a massive bribery plot were currently walking free. The authorities, caught completely off guard by my unprecedented media strategy, found themselves trapped in a massive public relations nightmare. The sheer volume of public pressure demanded an immediate, highly visible response to prevent total civic outrage. The district attorney, facing a catastrophic loss of public trust and an impending highly contested election cycle, moved with unprecedented and lethal efficiency. The original relatively minor charges stemming from the stolen vehicle and their pathetic brawl in my study were instantly rendered obsolete by the sheer gravity of the newly televised evidence. By dawn the following morning, a grand jury was hastily convened to formally review the unedited security footage of the basement staircase assault and the undeniable audio recording of Courtney's lethal bribery demand. The absolute clarity of the material left absolutely zero room for legal maneuvering, plea deals, or clever defense tactics. The district attorney aggressively upgraded the charges, officially signing primary felony warrants for premeditated attempted murder against Aaron. Courtney was certainly not spared from the vicious legal onslaught. The district attorney explicitly charged her with felony extortion, accessory to attempted murder after the fact, and severe obstruction of justice based on her recorded attempt to auction off her husband's freedom for a plane ticket. The warrants were stamped with an immediate execute order, completely revoking whatever fragile bail agreements they had previously secured from the stolen vehicle incident. Law enforcement agencies across the entire state were immediately placed on high alert. Unflattering mugshots of Aaron and Courtney, looking exhausted and disheveled from their previous arrest, were splashed across every major news network, highway billboard, and digital police bulletin. The authorities explicitly labeled them as a severe flight risk and highly dangerous fugitives fleeing felony charges. The massive coordinated manhunt was officially underway, fueled not just by legal duty, but by a humiliated police department desperate to regain control of the public narrative. The net had been cast wide, completely cutting off any remaining avenues of financial support or legal shelter. Aaron and Courtney were abruptly thrown into a frantic, desperate existence, completely devoid of the luxury high society validation and boundless entitlement that had defined their entire adult lives. They fled the city limits in a stolen, rust-eaten sedan, navigating dark, unpaved back roads to evade the heavy police presence actively hunting them across the state. They sought temporary shelter in a series of decaying, bug-infested roadside motels on the desolate outskirts of the county, paying the exorbitant nightly rates in stolen cash and using poorly fabricated identities. The crushing reality of their destitute situation rapidly eroded whatever fragile toxic bond they still shared. Locked inside cramped, filthy rooms with peeling wallpaper and deeply stained carpets, they viciously turned on each other with feral intensity. The paranoia became entirely suffocating. Courtney screamed relentless, vile accusations at Aaron, blaming his monumental incompetence and pathetic lack of foresight for destroying her pristine social standing and forcing her into a life of absolute squalor. Aaron fiercely retaliated, mocking her failed digital extortion plot and her profound inability to manipulate the public as she had so arrogantly promised. Their screaming matches frequently devolved into violent physical altercations, throwing cheap motel lamps and screaming hateful insults until their voices went completely hoarse. Their stolen cash reserves dwindled rapidly, forcing them to survive on stale vending machine snacks and metallic tap water. The physical toll of the brutal mob beating still ravaged Aaron's body, his fractured leg swelling painfully inside the dirty cast without any access to proper medical care or prescription pain management. Severe withdrawal from their accustomed elite lifestyle set in, replaced by a gnawing constant hunger and the terrifying, inescapable knowledge that every passing siren was coming directly for them. They were completely isolated, starving, and rapidly losing their sanity. Driven by absolute blinding desperation and severe agonizing physical hunger, Aaron made a final catastrophic miscalculation that would seal his ultimate fate. He left Courtney shivering under a thin blanket in a dark motel room and drove the stolen sedan to a brightly lit, highly isolated gas station just off the interstate highway. He concealed his bruised face beneath a dirty hooded sweatshirt and tucked a heavy black metal pipe into his waistband, foolishly intending to pass it off as a concealed firearm to intimidate the clerk. He limped heavily through the sliding glass doors, aggressively slamming his fists onto the counter and demanding the terrified teenage cashier empty the register into a plastic bag. Aaron was so entirely consumed by his own frantic need for basic sustenance and a handful of crumpled dollar bills that he completely failed to notice the silent alarm triggered securely beneath the counter. Within 60 seconds, the quiet desert night was violently interrupted by the deafening roar of armored vehicles and heavily armed tactical units. A county SWAT team already actively sweeping the sector for the high-profile fugitives descended upon the rural gas station with overwhelming lethal force. Highly trained snipers took immediate positions on the surrounding rooftops, while heavily armored officers completely surrounded the building, training dozens of blinding laser sights directly onto Aaron's chest through the storefront windows. The police deployed tear gas through the rear entrance, forcing a coughing, weeping Aaron to stumble blindly out the front doors. Officers immediately tackled him to the rough concrete pavement, violently wrenching his arms behind his back. Local news helicopters circled directly overhead, broadcasting the precise moment the elite tech executive was brutally pinned to the dirty asphalt. The arrogant son was permanently reduced to nothing but dust. The judicial hammer fell with absolute finality, echoing the sudden and total collapse of my son's life. The highly publicized trial concluded with a staggering swiftness driven by the insurmountable mountain of high-definition video evidence, audio recordings, and a complete lack of sympathetic jurors. The presiding judge showed zero leniency, sentencing both Aaron and Courtney to 15 years in a maximum security state penitentiary for their combined charges of felony extortion and premeditated attempted murder. The loud, chaotic media circus that had surrounded the courthouse finally dispersed, leaving a profound and heavy quiet in its wake. The Martha Trust remained an impenetrable fortress, its corporate foundations thoroughly scrubbed of any lingering vulnerability and entirely protected from future predatory assaults. My commercial tenants signed renewed ironclad leases, and the daily operations of my business empire returned to a state of flawless, highly profitable efficiency. The severe physical trauma I had sustained from my violent fall down the concrete stairs eventually faded, leaving only a dull, manageable ache that served as a permanent physical reminder of the ultimate betrayal. I no longer required the wooden cane to walk the manicured grounds of my estate, my physical strength fully restored. Yet despite the overwhelming legal victory and the absolute security of my wealth, a suffocating emotional void settled heavily over the sprawling property. The massive house, free from deceit and treachery, felt cavernous and profoundly empty. The quiet was no longer a sanctuary of peace. It was a deafening testament to the complete eradication of my bloodline. I had successfully excised a malignant tumor from my life, but the necessary surgery had left a permanent hollow space where my family used to reside. I walked the empty halls alone, surrounded by untouchable wealth and absolute silence. 6 months into his brutal incarceration, the heavy silence of my morning routine was interrupted by the arrival of a plain, heavily stamped envelope bearing the return address of the state correctional facility. The letter inside was meticulously handwritten on cheap-lined paper, entirely devoid of the aggressive entitlement that had once defined Aaron's entire vocabulary. He desperately begged for a single face-to-face visit, wrapping his pathetic plea in a thick layer of calculated religious awakening. He claimed the harsh reality of Cell Block D had stripped away his arrogance, leading him to a profound spiritual resurrection. He wrote extensively about finding God behind the reinforced steel bars, insisting that divine intervention had finally opened his eyes to the sheer magnitude of his monstrous actions against his own father. In a sickeningly transparent attempt to exploit my deepest emotional vulnerabilities, he heavily weaponized the sacred memory of my late wife. He explicitly invoked Martha's name, swearing that he finally understood the true meaning of the legacy she had envisioned for our family. He painted himself as a deeply remorseful prodigal son, desperate to honor his mother's memory by seeking my unconditional forgiveness. The sheer audacity of using the woman whose foundation he had actively tried to plunder as a shield for his own redemption was absolutely staggering. He meticulously crafted every sentence to project an aura of total submission, assuming that my paternal instincts would instantly override the undeniable facts of his attempted patricide. He firmly believed that a few paragraphs of feigned religious devotion and calculated nostalgia would act as a skeleton key, unlocking my frozen heart and granting him a renewed lifeline to the outside world. He fundamentally mistook my silence for lingering affection. I drove alone to the state penitentiary, navigating the bleak, heavily fortified perimeter with a singular, uncompromising purpose. After clearing the exhaustive security checkpoints and metal detectors, I was escorted into a sterile, brightly lit visitation room, divided entirely by thick, bulletproof glass. Aaron was led into the opposite booth wearing a faded, oversized orange jumpsuit, his posture completely devoid of the sharp executive confidence he had once weaponized. He picked up the heavy black telephone receiver, his eyes instantly welling with highly orchestrated theatrical tears. I held the receiver to my ear and remained perfectly silent, allowing him to launch into his meticulously rehearsed monologue. He delivered a flawless, weeping apology, expertly hitting every emotional note he had practiced in his concrete cell. He spoke at length about his newfound humility, his deep spiritual clarity, and his desperate yearning to repair the fractured bond between a father and his only son. He masterfully layered his feigned remorse with subtle, calculating requests for immediate financial relief. He painted a grim picture of the brutal prison environment, heavily implying that a substantial deposit into his commissary account would secure his physical safety among the violent, unpredictable inmate population. Furthermore, he smoothly transitioned into requesting that I hire a team of elite appellate attorneys, claiming that his renewed devotion to God made him highly deserving of a second chance at freedom. He sat there behind the smudged plexiglass, looking at me with the expectant, manipulative eyes of a parasite, waiting for the host to willingly expose a fresh vein. He fundamentally assumed my physical presence in the prison indicated a willingness to reopen the vault of my wealth and finance his eventual escape from justice. I let the hollow echo of his pathetic requests hang in the stale air of the visitation booth for a long, agonizing moment. I did not offer a single word of forgiveness, nor did I acknowledge his fabricated religious awakening. I simply reached into the inner pocket of my tailored jacket and produced a crisp, professionally bound legal document. I slid the paperwork through the narrow, stainless steel transfer slot at the base of the reinforced window. Aaron frowned, his tearful performance faltering completely as he picked up the packet and read the bold, capitalized header. It was a finalized, entirely irrevocable decree of divorce, already bearing Courtney's authenticated signature. I watched the fabricated hope drain entirely from his face as I calmly explained the brutal reality of his legal isolation. I informed him that his beloved wife had not experienced a sudden moral epiphany. Instead, she had utilized the absolute last shred of her ruthless self-preservation instinct. Facing a grueling 15-year sentence, she had actively turned state's evidence trading an extensive, highly detailed confession of Aaron's entire criminal conspiracy to the district attorney in direct exchange for a drastically reduced sentence and an immediate non-negotiable dissolution of their marriage. She had legally and permanently severed every single tie to him, throwing him entirely under the judicial bus to ensure her own eventual survival in the outside world. He was no longer a husband, he was no longer an heir, and he was no longer a threat. I placed the heavy black receiver back onto its metal cradle, permanently cutting off the audio connection. I stood up and walked away without a single backward glance, leaving Aaron completely alone behind the impenetrable glass, entirely buried under the inescapable weight of his own destruction. The iron doors of the state penitentiary slamming shut on Aaron and Courtney did not completely sever the tentacles of their disastrous financial ruin. The underground syndicate that had originally hunted my son was entirely unwilling to write off a multi-million-dollar deficit simply because their primary target was incarcerated. Operating through highly sophisticated legal proxies, the mob creditors launched a massive, aggressively coordinated civil assault directly against the Martha Trust. They retained a notoriously ruthless corporate litigation shark from a premier city firm, a man whose entire career was built on dismantling generational wealth and exploiting obscure legal loopholes. This predatory attorney filed a sprawling petition in federal bankruptcy court, formally arguing that since Aaron was my sole biological descendant, he was the inherent default beneficiary of my entire estate. The lawsuit maliciously posited that my deliberate withholding of trust funds to cover Aaron's debts was an illegal act of financial concealment designed to defraud legitimate creditors. They demanded that a federal judge aggressively pierce the corporate veil of the Martha Trust, liquidate its vast holdings, and forcibly divert the proceeds to satisfy the staggering debts my son had accumulated in the criminal underworld. The sheer audacity of the legal maneuver was breathtaking. They were attempting to utilize the highest echelons of the federal justice system to essentially launder their extortion, transforming a violent mob debt into a court-ordered asset seizure. I sat in my study reading the dense, threatening legal summons, fully realizing that the syndicate had shifted their battlefield from abandoned warehouses to federal courtrooms. They intended to legally bulldoze the very foundation of the empire I had spent 40 years building with my bare hands, treating my life's work as nothing more than a convenient collateral fund for a convicted felon. Bradley immediately mobilized our entire legal defense team, transforming my private estate into a highly secure command center for the impending federal litigation. The stakes were absolute and potentially catastrophic. If the high-priced corporate shark successfully convinced the bankruptcy judge to pierce the Martha Trust, the meticulously structured legal fortress protecting my life's work would instantly crumble. Every commercial property, every real estate holding, and every liquid asset I had painstakingly accumulated over 4 decades of grueling labor would be violently ripped away and fed directly into the insatiable maw of a criminal syndicate. Bradley worked relentlessly through the night, compiling towering stacks of financial ledgers, corporate charters, and trust bylaws, fully preparing to defend my legacy against a predatory legal strategy designed to bleed me completely dry. The trial commenced a month later in the austere, imposing environment of the federal bankruptcy court. I sat silently beside Bradley at the polished defense table, projecting an aura of unwavering resolve while the opposition's attorney paced aggressively across the courtroom floor. The corporate shark delivered a highly polished, aggressive opening statement painting me as a vindictive billionaire illegally sheltering assets that rightfully belonged to my son's desperate creditors. He weaponized complex legal precedents and deployed aggressive financial rhetoric, attempting to weave a compelling narrative that Aaron possessed an irrevocable vested interest in my estate simply by virtue of his bloodline. The opposition firmly believed they could overwhelm the court with a barrage of technicalities, legally compelling the immediate liquidation of the Martha Trust to satisfy Aaron's horrific financial obligations. I watched the ruthless attorney confidently lay out his strategy to dismantle my entire world, remaining perfectly still, knowing that Bradley held the ultimate defensive weapon securely in his leather briefcase. When it was finally time for the defense to present its case, Bradley stood up and calmly approached the federal judge's bench. He did not engage in passionate theatrics or attempt to debate the complex financial precedents cited by the opposing counsel. Instead, he smoothly extracted a single heavily sealed document from his portfolio. It was the original foundational charter of the Martha Trust, a document I had meticulously drafted alongside Bradley more than 10 years ago. Bradley respectfully directed the judge's attention to a deeply embedded, highly specific clause explicitly labeled the bad actor provision. He read the precise legal terminology aloud, his clear voice echoing off the high ceiling of the courtroom. The airtight provision mandated the immediate, automatic, and completely irrevocable excision of any designated beneficiary formally convicted of a violent felony against the trust's founding creator. Bradley presented the certified court records of Aaron's recent 15-year criminal sentence for premeditated attempted murder, laying the undeniable proof of his treachery directly onto the judicial record. The moment Aaron was convicted of pushing me down those concrete basement stairs, he effectively triggered his own total legal annihilation. Bradley meticulously explained that the provision did not simply remove Aaron from the current line of succession. It retroactively and permanently erased his entire legal standing within the trust, classifying him as a complete stranger in the eyes of the estate. The corporate shark's entire argument hinged on Aaron holding an inherent right to my wealth through his bloodline. Bradley's brilliant, drip-fed revelation completely obliterated that foundation, proving with absolute legal certainty that Aaron possessed zero claim, zero equity, and absolutely zero connection to the assets the mob creditors were so desperately attempting to seize. The federal judge meticulously reviewed the original trust charter and the corresponding criminal conviction records, the heavy silence in the courtroom stretching into a profound tension. Finding the bad actor provision to be utterly airtight and legally flawless, the judge slammed his gavel down with absolute resounding finality. He formally upheld the total sovereignty of the Martha Trust, completely rejecting the opposition's aggressive petition to pierce the corporate veil. The judge subsequently dismissed the mob creditors' sprawling lawsuit with extreme prejudice, permanently barring them from ever attempting to target my estate again. To further penalize their blatant attempt to manipulate the federal bankruptcy courts for criminal extortion, the judge ordered the opposing syndicate to fully reimburse my entire legal team for the exorbitant costs of defending against their frivolous litigation. The highly paid corporate shark stood frozen at his table, entirely humiliated and thoroughly defeated by a single brilliantly orchestrated clause. The legal fortress protecting my life's work was now officially impenetrable, thoroughly tested in federal court, and proven absolutely unbreakable against the most ruthless predators. I exited the imposing courthouse alongside Bradley, stepping out into the bright afternoon sun, with my legacy completely secured and my enemies vanquished. The syndicate was left holding millions in uncollectible debt, and Aaron was left rotting in a concrete cell entirely erased from my history. I had successfully defended my empire against every treacherous assault, preserving the immense wealth I had spent a lifetime building from the ground up. However, as the heavy wooden doors of the federal building closed behind me, a profound and lingering question echoed in the quiet space of my mind. With my only son permanently excised and my bloodline severed, who would ultimately inherit the keys to my impenetrable kingdom? Returning to the sprawling, silent estate after the resounding victory in federal bankruptcy court brought a profound sense of finality. The immediate threats from the syndicate and my son had been systematically dismantled, leaving the Martha Trust entirely secure. Yet a shadow remained firmly cast over the property. The basement staircase, the exact location where Aaron had violently shoved me in his desperate bid for control, sat untouched. For months I had deliberately avoided that lower level. It remained a dark, suffocating space, a frozen monument to the ultimate betrayal and the sheer physical trauma that had nearly claimed my life. The scuff marks on the concrete and the heavy, stagnant air felt like lingering ghosts of Aaron's sociopathic greed. However, allowing a single square foot of my home to remain a shrine to his treachery was entirely unacceptable. I refused to surrender any part of my sanctuary to the memory of a failed patricide. The space needed to be completely purged, not simply cleaned, but aggressively conquered and fundamentally repurposed. I walked down those steep concrete steps for the first time since the assault, the familiar chill of the subterranean air washing over me. I stood on the exact spot where I had landed, broken and bleeding, looking at the decaying drywall and the dim, flickering bulb overhead. The raw, violent energy of that night still permeated the walls, demanding a radical transformation. I decided in that quiet moment that I would not simply erase the trauma. I would permanently overwrite it. I would take the very space where Aaron had attempted to destroy my legacy and forge it into the strongest, most enduring pillar of the entire Martha Trust. The reclamation process began the very next morning with absolute uncompromising intensity. Before my immense corporate success, my hands had built the foundation of my empire from raw concrete and steel, and I fully intended to rely on those deeply ingrained skills once again. I bypassed the elite corporate contractors and personally hired a specialized, highly efficient demolition crew to gut the subterranean space down to its core elements. We systematically ripped away the water-damaged, moldy drywall, exposing the bare structural bones of the foundation. I strapped on my old leather tool belt, the familiar weight providing a grounding comfort as I worked directly alongside the laborers. We violently tore out the old failing infrastructure, hauling away heavy debris until nothing remained but clean, unyielding concrete. Once the space was completely stripped of its dark history, the aggressive reconstruction commenced. We heavily reinforced the foundational pillars, utilizing commercial-grade steel beams to ensure the structural integrity of the floor above. The oppressive, shadowy atmosphere was instantly banished by the installation of a state-of-the-art high-end LED lighting system, flooding every single corner of the expansive room with brilliant clinical illumination. We laid down polished premium hardwood flooring over the cold cement and erected pristine, soundproofed glass partitions to divide the massive area into functional professional sectors. The physical labor was grueling, demanding intense focus and sweat, but the physical exertion served as a necessary, highly effective catharsis. With every swing of the hammer and every freshly painted wall, the traumatic memory of Aaron's attack was systematically pulverized and permanently buried beneath layers of flawless modern architecture. The basement was no longer a dark, forgotten cavern. It was a bright, commanding fortress, waiting for its ultimate purpose. The extensive architectural overhaul was merely the physical manifestation of a much grander, highly targeted ideological shift. I refused to let the Martha Trust simply operate as a massive, passive holding company. It required an active, aggressive mechanism to fight the exact type of predatory betrayal I had just survived. I formally transformed the newly illuminated basement into a high-powered, fully funded pro bono legal clinic entirely dedicated to protecting elderly and vulnerable individuals from familial financial abuse. The trauma site where my own son had attempted to murder me for an early inheritance was explicitly repurposed into an elite headquarters for absolute justice. I personally financed the recruitment of top-tier attorneys, aggressive forensic accountants, and seasoned social workers, assembling a relentless strike force designed to dismantle extortion attempts, prosecute elder fraud, and legally annihilate predatory relatives. The clinic was outfitted with advanced communication technology, secure corporate servers, and private consultation suites, providing a safe, impenetrable haven for victims who had been manipulated, threatened, or robbed by their own blood. The Martha Trust Legal Clinic was not a passive charity. It was a highly weaponized legal machine explicitly engineered to level the playing field against calculating family members who viewed their elders as nothing more than disposable bank accounts. Bradley oversaw the meticulous legal structuring of the organization, guaranteeing its immediate operational authority and integrating it directly into the unbreakable charter of my estate. By directly weaponizing my immense wealth to shield others from the exact nightmare I had endured, I stripped Aaron of his final lingering victory. His violent attempt to steal my legacy had ultimately birthed the very institution that would relentlessly hunt down and legally crucify predators exactly like him. The official grand opening of the Martha Trust Legal Clinic was an event of undeniable, overwhelming magnitude, drawing the immediate attention of the entire city. The newly minted facility buzzed with a powerful electric energy as elite corporate figures, prominent local politicians, and leading news anchors crowded into the pristine glass-walled space. They had all witnessed the highly publicized, spectacular downfall of my son, and they were desperate to see the final culmination of my unprecedented response. I stood calmly at the front of the expansive room, flanked by Bradley and the newly appointed senior directors of the clinic, projecting an aura of total, unshakable authority. The bright television cameras focused tightly on my face as a profound, expectant hush fell over the packed audience. They recognized that this was not merely a philanthropic ribbon-cutting ceremony. It was the definitive final chapter in a deeply public war for survival. I adjusted the microphone, looking out over the sea of eager faces, completely unfazed by the intense media scrutiny. I briefly addressed the brutal reality of elder abuse and the uncompromising mission of the new clinic, ensuring my words resonated with absolute clarity. Then I smoothly transitioned to the ultimate lingering question that had captivated the public and the financial sector alike since Aaron's permanent incarceration. I reached into my tailored suit pocket and produced a single legally binding document, the freshly authenticated, completely revised charter of the Martha Trust. I looked directly into the primary broadcast lens, preparing to deliver the final devastating blow to Aaron's erased legacy. I took a slow, deliberate breath, steadying my voice to formally announce the identity of the completely unexpected new sole beneficiary of my entire multi-million-dollar empire. I held the revised charter of the Martha Trust in my hand, the crisp parchment feeling like a loaded weapon ready to be fired. The sea of flashing cameras and expectant faces waited in breathless anticipation for the name of the new heir to fall from my lips. Before I could speak a single syllable into the microphone, a subtle murmur rippled through the back of the expansive glass-walled clinic. The heavy soundproof doors slid open with a soft mechanical hiss, drawing the collective gaze of the room away from the podium. A yellow city cab idled at the base of the newly paved driveway, its taillights glowing brightly in the early evening dusk. A young, elegantly dressed African-American woman stepped out of the vehicle, her posture projecting a quiet, undeniable dignity that instantly separated her from the ruthless corporate sharks and hungry politicians crowding the room. She held the small hand of a 4-year-old boy dressed in a sharp, perfectly tailored miniature suit. The crowd naturally parted, forming a narrow, silent aisle as the woman and the child walked deliberately toward the front of the room. The blinding flashes of the press cameras momentarily ceased, replaced by a profound, heavy confusion. The elite guests whispered among themselves, utterly failing to comprehend how these two uninvited strangers factored into the highly publicized resolution of my family's catastrophic collapse. Bradley stood completely motionless at my side, his eyes fixed sharply on the approaching figures. He did not signal security to intervene, nor did he express a single ounce of surprise. The ambient noise of the grand opening completely vanished entirely, replaced by the rhythmic, deliberate sound of the young woman's heels clicking against the polished hardwood floor as she led the boy directly toward my podium. I watched them approach with a profound, unshakable calm, my eyes locking onto the young woman who had survived my son's supreme cowardice. Her name was Maya. 5 years ago, she had been Aaron's brilliant, fiercely loyal fiancée, a woman who possessed genuine ambition and a compassionate soul. She had loved him long before the intoxicating allure of elite social validation had completely rotted his moral compass. When Maya unexpectedly became pregnant, Aaron was faced with a definitive choice between stepping up to the grueling responsibilities of actual fatherhood or chasing the hollow, glittering facade of high society wealth. He callously chose the latter. Terrified that a sudden, unplanned family would permanently derail his desperate attempts to infiltrate the city's upper echelon, Aaron ruthlessly discarded Maya. He aggressively forced her out of his life, utilizing a barrage of cruel legal threats to ensure she moved away silently and permanently. He immediately replaced her with Courtney, a woman whose sole defining attribute was a highly fabricated, ruthlessly manicured social media presence. Aaron actively traded a lifetime of authentic, unconditional love for a toxic, superficial partnership built entirely on mutual greed and boundless entitlement. He fundamentally believed that he had permanently buried his past, completely erasing his biological child from existence to protect his impending marriage and secure his absolute claim to my fortune. He assumed that his cowardly intimidation tactics had permanently silenced Maya, leaving him entirely free to plunder the Martha Trust without any inconvenient emotional attachments tying him to the real world. He had systematically eliminated the mother of his child from the equation, entirely unaware that his treacherous discard was the precise moment I began to actively scrutinize his true character. His decision to abandon his own flesh and blood for the illusion of prestige was the original, unforgivable sin that fundamentally fractured our relationship long before he ever laid his hands on me. As Maya stopped at the base of the podium, I turned slightly toward Bradley, offering him a brief, knowing nod. While the rest of the city believed I was entirely isolated and completely oblivious to my son's actions, Bradley and I had spent the last 4 years executing a highly classified, impenetrable financial quarantine. I had known about the child since the very day Aaron viciously drove Maya away. Instead of confronting my son and triggering a volatile, unpredictable conflict, I chose to operate entirely in the shadows. I immediately deployed a labyrinth of anonymous legal proxies and heavily encrypted offshore accounts to establish an absolute safety net around Maya and the boy. I quietly purchased a beautiful, secure home in a quiet suburban neighborhood, placing the deed directly into a blind trust entirely beyond Aaron's reach or knowledge. For 4 consecutive years, I systematically funded my grandson's premium health care, his elite early education, and Maya's continued university studies without ever revealing my identity to the outside world. I deliberately kept them completely hidden from my public life to actively protect them from Aaron's toxic orbit and Courtney's predatory jealousy. If my son or his venomous wife had ever discovered the boy's existence, they would have relentlessly weaponized him, legally terrorizing Maya to extort even more wealth from my estate. By maintaining a fortress of absolute silence, I ensured the child grew up surrounded by genuine affection and total financial security, completely insulated from the sociopathic greed that ultimately destroyed his biological father. The Martha Trust was never intended to finance the arrogant delusions of a criminal. It was meticulously designed to nurture the innocent, and I had spent 4 years silently cultivating the true future of my legacy in the dark. The 4-year-old boy stepped bravely forward, pulling slightly ahead of his mother to look directly up at me. The harsh clinical lighting of the basement clinic fell across his small face, illuminating a set of striking, undeniable features that sent a powerful physical jolt straight through my chest. He possessed the exact same intense, intelligent eyes and the familiar, gentle curve of the jawline that had defined my late wife. Looking at the boy was like staring into a living, breathing reflection of Martha herself. The biological connection was absolutely undeniable, a pure continuation of the bloodline entirely untouched by Aaron's corruption. I slowly lowered the revised trust charter onto the polished wood of the podium and stepped down from the raised platform. The collective breath of the elite crowd caught in their throats as I bypassed the microphones, knelt down onto the hard floor, and opened my arms. The boy did not hesitate. He walked straight into my embrace, wrapping his small arms securely around my neck. The blinding flashes of the press cameras erupted into a frenzied, chaotic storm, capturing the profound emotional weight of a grandfather holding his legacy for the first time in public view. The gathered politicians, the corporate sharks, and the breathless news anchors finally understood the staggering depth of my long-term strategy. They realized that my brutal legal annihilation of Aaron was never about protecting a hollow fortune. It was about permanently clearing the rot to ensure the survival of the healthy roots. I stood back up, holding the boy's hand firmly in mine, and faced the stunned audience. The empire was completely secure, the predators were caged, and the rightful heir to the Martha Trust had finally come home. I stepped back up to the polished wooden podium, gripping the edges firmly, as a profound silence settled over the crowded room. The blinding flashes of the cameras had finally ceased, replaced by the intense, unblinking focus of every journalist, politician, and corporate executive present. I kept my left hand resting reassuringly on my grandson's small shoulder. Looking out into the sea of expectant faces, I formally introduced Maya to the city. I spoke clearly and deliberately, detailing her remarkable resilience, her sharp intellect, and the quiet dignity she had maintained while raising my grandson entirely on her own. I deliberately omitted Aaron's name from her history, refusing to give his toxic ghost any further oxygen in this new chapter. Instead, I introduced the 4-year-old boy standing beside me as the living embodiment of Martha's enduring vision for our family. I held up the newly authenticated legal charter and explicitly announced that the entire multi-million-dollar Martha Trust had been fundamentally and permanently restructured. The corporate holding company that had previously served as a vast vulnerable target for syndicate predators and treacherous relatives no longer existed in its original form. I detailed how Bradley and I had legally dissolved the previous inheritance hierarchy, completely stripping away the outdated mechanisms that would have allowed a biological son to claim default ownership. The immense commercial real estate portfolio, the liquid assets, and the lucrative corporate contracts were now legally bound to a completely new foundational structure. The gathered reporters furiously typed on their phones and recorded every single word as I officially declared that the vast fortune I had spent 4 decades building from raw concrete and steel had been entirely redirected. The absolute power of the estate had fundamentally shifted. Looking directly into the primary broadcast lens, I officially named my 4-year-old grandson as the sole unchallengeable heir to the entire real estate empire. I explained the ironclad parameters of the newly established Educational and Developmental Trust. The staggering wealth would remain entirely locked and rigorously managed by an independent, impenetrable board of directors until the boy reached exactly 30 years of age. Before he could access a single cent of the principal corporate capital, he would be required to complete his higher education, participate actively in the management of the pro bono legal clinic, and prove his moral competency to the fiduciary board. I engineered the strict legal mechanism to ensure that the suffocating entitlement that had completely destroyed Aaron could never infect the next generation. The boy would learn the absolute value of hard work, discipline, and empathy long before he ever felt the weight of immense financial power. He would understand the profound responsibility of wealth rather than viewing it as a blank check for limitless hedonism. The bitter irony of the entire saga was finally laid bare for the public to witness. If Aaron had simply embraced his responsibilities as a father and rejected the shallow, fabricated validation of high society status, he would have eventually inherited the entire kingdom. His relentless pursuit of extreme wealth and his cowardly abandonment of Maya were the exact catalysts that secured his permanent erasure from the family tree. His sociopathic greed, his violent physical assault on me, and his treacherous alliance with Courtney had directly triggered the absolute destruction of his own birthright. He had burned down his entire universe, chasing a fortune that he had foolishly handed directly to the son he threw away. The local news networks carried the entire dedication ceremony completely live, broadcasting my unfiltered announcement into millions of homes, businesses, and government facilities across the state. Hundreds of miles away, inside the sterile, heavily fortified walls of the maximum security penitentiary, the broadcast flickered across a mounted television screen in the crowded inmate recreation room. Aaron sat in his faded orange uniform at a bolted metal table, entirely stripped of his tailored suits and his arrogant corporate swagger. He was trapped in a chaotic, dangerous environment, existing at the absolute bottom of a ruthless social hierarchy. As my voice echoed from the television speakers, his eyes locked onto the screen. He watched in stunned, agonizing horror as the camera zoomed in on the faces of Maya and the 4-year-old boy holding my hand. The brutal, inescapable reality of his situation violently crushed him in that exact moment. He witnessed the biological son he had so callously discarded standing at the center of the empire he had viciously tried to steal. He saw the unimaginable wealth, the prestigious real estate portfolio, and the generational power he had coveted his entire life, permanently bestowed upon the child he had traded for a fake socialite. The devastating psychological destruction was absolute and irreversible. He realized that his violent treachery had not only failed to secure his fortune, but it had guaranteed that the boy he abandoned would ultimately reign as the sole king of his father's domain. He was left with exactly 15 years of concrete walls, steel bars, and the suffocating, inescapable knowledge that his own supreme cowardice had engineered his total permanent replacement. The prison noise faded away, leaving him completely buried under the crushing weight of his catastrophic failure. The immense chaos that had aggressively threatened to consume my life over the past year finally dissolved, replaced by a profound and enduring stability. The necessary brutal amputation of the parasites had been entirely successful. The relentless mob creditors had been legally vanquished. Courtney was permanently locked away after turning state's evidence, and Aaron was left to rot in maximum security isolation. The corporate foundation of the Martha Trust was now fortified beyond any possibility of future infiltration, completely protected by the elite legal clinic operating in the bright, reimagined space of my basement. Order was fully and unconditionally restored. I stood on the expansive wooden porch of my estate later that evening, the warm, golden light of the setting sun casting long shadows across the manicured lawns. The heavy, deafening silence that had previously haunted the massive property was gone. Instead, the joyful, energetic laughter of my grandson echoed across the yard as he chased a stray butterfly through the grass. Maya sat peacefully in a wicker chair nearby, reading a book and enjoying the quiet security of their new life. I walked down the wooden steps and knelt in the soft grass, holding out my hand. The boy ran over and gripped my fingers tightly, looking up at me with Martha's bright, intelligent eyes. The silent, meticulous adjustment of my universe was completely finished. I had endured the ultimate betrayal, surgically excising a monster from my own bloodline to protect the innocent from his sociopathic wrath. I lost a treacherous son to his own blinding greed, but in the ashes of that catastrophic failure, I had successfully secured a magnificent, thriving legacy that would endure for generations. The most profound lesson drawn from this grueling ordeal is that true generational wealth is measured entirely by character, not currency. Greed and entitlement act as a corrosive poison, rapidly destroying the very foundations of a family from the inside out. When individuals prioritize superficial social validation over authentic human connection, they inevitably orchestrate their own catastrophic downfall. Protecting a legacy requires the absolute willingness to sever toxic ties, regardless of biological bonds. Ultimately, genuine justice is achieved not through vindictive revenge, but by actively securing the future for the innocent and ensuring that treachery yields only permanent, irreversible isolation. Please hit the like button if you enjoyed this story of resilience and absolute justice, and be sure to subscribe to the channel for more thrilling narratives.